It's the spring of 1999 in the blue-collar town of Easton, Pennsylvania. 18-year-old high school dropout Michelle Hetzel is at home on the south side of town.
Michelle was a pretty girl. She was tall, she was thin, she had blonde hair. She was a nice girl. I mean, she kept to herself, she was quiet.
Michelle had an older brother and sister, much older. So she was like a late life baby, but happy. I mean, she always seemed happy.
But growing up almost as an only child, Michelle has always struggled to fit in.
Michelle was a storyteller, and you could tell. You could be like, come on, Michelle, you're making up stories. But she actually believed a lot of the stuff she said. For some reason, she needed attention and needed that drama in her life, and she craved it. Believe me, she made sure she got it.
Michelle's childhood was full of ups and downs, but about a year ago, she hit rock bottom when her family's situation deteriorated and she was placed into foster care. But what at first seemed like a bleak change turned out to be a stroke of good luck for Michelle. At her new home, she met and fell in love with the family's eldest son, 25-year-old Brandon Bloss.
You doing painting your nails?
Yeah, pink.
I like it.
Thanks.
Michelle was the foster child, and he had lived there. He was a good friend, and then she started dating him.
Brandon was a smart young man. He had degrees in chemistry and math, and his future looked bright.
The couple has only been dating a few months, but they're already engaged to be married. To Michelle, it looks like Brandon is a chance to have the happy life that a year ago she could never have dreamed of.
I think she wanted a wedding. She wanted the car. And Brandon was the perfect prop when Brandon came into her life to say, Michelle, I can give you these things.
Michelle saw Brandon as a guy who's going to be successful, maybe make some money.
For Michelle and Brandon, life in Easton is familiar and comfortable. Both grew up going to local schools, and even now spend most of their time hanging out with Michelle's two best friends, Devin and Kiri.
Devin, Carrie, and Michelle all met through high school, and the three of them were together all the time and did things together all the time.
Devin was carefree and full of life. She worked hard, she loved family. She was happy. For the most part, she was a happy person.
Carrie was tall, she had blonde hair, she was very nice. She seemed to be fun.
Now that Michelle is with Brandon, the trio has grown to a foursome.
Not a problem. You want a burger or a dog?
You vegan? Hot dog. Yeah.
Hot dog. All right.
On the surface, they are all the best of friends. Michelle is keeping a dark secret from her devoted fiancé, Brandon. Only a few months after getting engaged, she's cheating on him with the last person he would ever suspect, her best friend, 18-year-old Devin Guzman.
Michelle and Devin were friends. At some point, it went beyond that, and it eventually developed into a sexual relationship. These girls being the same age, they were into this experimentation and finding their sexuality, whatever they were doing. And it was just a party atmosphere as well.
The intense chemistry of this taboo relationship gives Michelle a thrill that Brandon could never provide.
They have a secret and an understanding. They understand each other in a way that nobody else could possibly understand. It really heightens not just the love, but the sexual turn-on between them.
This secret affair is nothing new. Conflicted by her emotions, Michelle has split and gotten back together with Devin many times over the years.
The kind of person Michelle was. She would pull Devin closer and then push her away, but she would only keep her at arm's length so that she could bring her back in when she wanted her. I couldn't tell my daughter enough that you just need to walk away and, move on with your life because this isn't working out with her.
But Devin always takes her secret lover back.
Devin cared for her so much, she just was so confused. She went running every time Michelle called her.
Meanwhile, Michelle's fiancé, Brandon, has no idea that his soon-to-be wife is sleeping with her best friend. He's too busy focusing on building a future for them.
He did work a lot. He had a steady job, and plus he had a second part-time job, so a lot of his hours were tied up.
Between Brandon and Devin, the down-on-her-luck foster child has everything she's ever wanted.
Michelle had Brandon. He gave her things that Devin never could give her. It was like Michelle wanted the financial security from Brandon, but the passion from Devin.
While Brandon has no idea about his fiancé's adulterous ways, Devin's steady girlfriend, Kiri, knows them all too well.
In high school, Michelle and Carrie would fight for Devin's attention. It was more like three was a crowd, and there was always an odd person out.
And at the moment, it's Kiri who's feeling like that third wheel as she senses Michelle and Devin's connection heating back up.
Michelle kept resurfacing into their relationship. I believe Carrie would get very angry and hurt when Devin would focus on Michelle.
So there was definitely tension in this relationship between these three girls.
The long-suffering Kiri believes in her heart of hearts that Devin will wise up and choose her.
I really honestly believe Carrie knew that Devin would be back for good one of these days.
Throughout the rest of 1999, 18-year-old Michelle continues to bounce between Brandon and Devin, professing her love and devotion to both. But in early 2000, she finally tells Devin the hard truth. She is going forward with her marriage to Brandon. Devin is devastated.
I think she was shocked, and it's the same hindsight as if she was losing somebody. She was probably jealous. I'm sure she was hurt. I'm sure, she's watching somebody that she loves marry somebody else.
Devin begs her lover to reconsider, but to no avail. In just 2 weeks, Michelle and Brandon will be married. Over the next few days, sadness turns to fury as the spurned teen decides she isn't going to give up without a fight.
Devin's behavior, it was very irrational at times. She's jealous that Michelle's getting married. She starts to basically stalk her. She does not want to let her go.
Devin would drive by the house, honking and yelling about their relationship and how much she loved her.
You have to stop it. She has to go.
Shocked by Devin's behavior, Brandon confronts Michelle about her relationship with her old friend. Michelle maintains it's not her fault. It's Devin who's become totally obsessed with her.
I think Michelle would play the part, Devin keeps calling me, Devin keeps showing up here, and I think it was more like a facade. I'm trying to make this work, but Devin keeps doing this.
Though he still doesn't know about the affair, Brandon makes it clear to Michelle that she needs to cut Devin out of her life.
I know that Brandon pushed a lot of stress on Michelle about contacting Devin.
Last week, she was honking the horn and screaming.
Michelle placates her fiancé by agreeing to end her friendship with Devin. But can she keep her promise? Or will her double life result in horrific consequences for them all? By the beginning of 2000, 18-year-old Michelle Hetzel and her best friend Devin Guzman have reignited their on and off affair. When they're together, their passion is overwhelming.
Michelle and Devin's love affair is very typical of adolescent love. It's almost obsessive. They can't think of anything but each other.
Michelle's fiancé, Brandon, is unaware of their sexual relationship, but has grown tired of the constant drama and harassment coming from Devin towards his soon-to-be wife. He insists that Michelle stop seeing Devin for good. Michelle agrees.
You know, I think Michelle wanted to be with Brandon. I think that part of her wanted to live the normal life.
Brandon puts up with Michelle lying to him. Brandon didn't want to lose her, so he was going to do whatever it took to keep his wife there.
But if Brandon thinks Michelle's seen the last of Devin, he's sorely mistaken. The jilted lover isn't gonna stand by while her ex runs off and gets married. When her obsessive stalking doesn't sway Michelle, Devin knows she has a trump card up her sleeve.
Michelle kept her sexuality hidden from most people.
Despite a year spent in foster care, Michelle's real mom and dad still play a big role in her life.
She was very worried about her parents. They treated her like a little princess, so I think she tried to keep the image up in front of her parents.
Devin knows this is Michelle's Achilles heel, and she shoots straight for it.
She would call Michelle's parents, telling them about their relationship and how much she loved her. Anything she could do to sabotage it, sort of make it in a non-subtle way that she was bisexual.
During this period before Michelle's wedding, Devin really becomes unhinged. Her stalking behavior, almost harassing behavior, really becomes continual and chronic. And it's really fueled by the idea that Michelle is not reacting to any of it.
But it's when Devin calls Michelle's parents that she finally gets a rise out of her ex, just not the one she wanted. In January 2000, a month before her wedding, Michelle goes to the police.
There was a harassment complaint that was filed. This was filed by Michelle Hetzel, alleging that Devin was, in fact, harassing her, stalking her, and she wanted it to end.
Police issue a restraining order against Devin. And on February 26, 2000, Michelle and Brandon are married. At first, Devin is crushed. But by March, she seems to accept that Michelle is gone for good. So she moves back in with her patient ex-girlfriend, Carrie. And finally, their relationship begins to blossom.
Carrie had a strong affection for Devin, and there was some belief that Devin really was in love with Carrie.
Carrie and Devin were going to move to outside the area to Arizona, discussed possibly adopting a child, but they were going to definitely move forward with their relationship.
I think Devin started to move on with Carrie. Whether that's what she wanted, I'm not really sure.
Meanwhile, Michelle and Brandon also seem to be off to a fresh new start. In the days following their wedding, the newlyweds are the picture of happiness.
When they first got married, they were honeymooners and things were going well. They bought a small house in Southside, moved in together, and they were planning on living happily ever after.
It seems as if Michelle's decision to put Devin behind her is real. But under that contented surface, it turns out that the forbidden affair is just too sweet for her to forget. She can't keep Devin out of her mind. Just days after marrying Brandon, Michelle goes to see her lost love.
There was something that kept Michelle and Devin going back to each other. Michelle was obsessed with Devin, absolutely obsessed with Devin.
The two best friends can't keep their hands off each other.
After Michelle got married, she was torn. She would come over and be with Devin and try to make future plans with her, like we're gonna get an apartment together.
Let's move in together. But, yeah, I mean, you're married.
I don't love him. I'm only doing it for my parents. Michelle was always promising to Devin that it was going to be the two of them and not Brandon.
Devin perhaps recognizes this as the ploy that it is. Even though she's hurt by the idea that Michelle would marry a man, she understands Michelle can't possibly love Brandon the way that she loves Devin.
In the weeks after the wedding, 18-year-old Michelle plays the part of a blissfully happy honeymooner with her new husband, Brandon. But she's back with her secret teenage lover, Devin. The illicit passion between them flames higher than ever before. It's only a matter of time before Brandon notices his wife's attention is elsewhere. In April 2000, things between the newlyweds come to a head.
Where do you think you're going? Where do you think you're going? You have to tell me.
Brandon started to realize that Michelle was leaving and going out and spending a lot of time with Devin, which put pressure on their marriage and their relationship. Michelle would leave her husband and go run off with Devin somewhere and maybe not come home at night or whatever.
The suspicious husband finally sees the writing on the wall. His wife and Devin are a lot more than just friends.
Brandon knew that Michelle and Devin were having a relationship, and I believe he was very jealous about that. I believe that he truly loved Michelle, and he would probably do anything to keep her as his wife.
A woman! A woman!
I've never had an affair!
The new husband makes it very clear that he isn't going to put up with infidelity.
Things started to deteriorate rather quickly. There were fights at this location where they were residing, that some of this spilled outside to shouting matches.
I am restraining myself right now.
A neighbor across the street hears an argument, and he looks out. It's Brandon and Michelle arguing, and Brandon's cursing, and Michelle's just ignoring him.
You can take your stuff and get the hell out of my house.
Michelle's home life is spiraling out of control. But rather than face her problems head on, she makes a decision that will take the situation from bad to horrific. Over the Memorial Day weekend of 2000, she disappears.
Michelle took Devin on this surprise trip, and Michelle footed the bill for everything, charged it on her credit card unknowingly to Brandon.
I think Michelle was definitely using her ability to charge gifts and trips and things to lure Devin back into her inner circle.
Michelle taking Devin on the trip was her way of saying, I'm committed to you. Come on, I'm taking you away. This is how I'm going to prove I love you and I want to be with you.
On that trip, the infatuated girls take a big leap in their commitment and pledge their lives to each other.
Michelle was trying to prove to Devin, you are the one I want, not my husband. Let's do this. I'll marry you. We will come back. You move, I'll pack up, and we can be together.
Devin returns to Easton, convinced that she has a future with Michelle. She even takes the bold step of telling her girlfriend Kiri about her and Michelle running off and exchanging rings.
To my knowledge, this comes as a shock to Carrie, because Carrie's believing that Devin and her are, together. Why is she off with Michelle? She becomes very, very upset about the whole thing.
It's hard to tell you like this.
She's going back and forth between Michelle and Carrie. It's just almost like a pinball game, and sometimes Carrie's the ball and sometimes Michelle's the ball.
Devastated and angry, Kiri can't accept what she's hearing.
When Carrie finds out about Devin taking this trip with Michelle and that they had this little wedding ceremony and she's going to leave and live with Michelle, an argument and a physical confrontation does ensue.
The third person in this triangle, Carrie, has been long-suffering and has tolerated a great deal in the musical chairs of these relationships.
Pushed to her emotional limit, Kiri finally snaps.
Devin's telling Carrie what has happened, and Carrie, in an act of desperation, grabs a knife.
Up till now, Kiri has suffered her girlfriend's fickle ways in silence. But all that is about to change with one violent stroke. "18-year-old Devin Guzman has been cheating on her teenage partner, Kiri, with a high school friend named Michelle Hetzel.
In high school, Carrie, Devin, and Michelle were all friends, and it seemed like that Michelle and Carrie would fight for Devon's attentions.
In the past, Kiri has let things ride. But now that she's discovered Devon has promised a future to Michelle, she explodes in a violent rage.
How could you do this to me?
Carrie, in an act of desperation, grabs a knife.
She was hurt. She was angry. All the emotions that you're going to feel when someone that you care about runs off with somebody else.
Devon thinks she's the intended victim, but Kiri's knife has a different intended target.
She's threatening to kill herself.
Devon tries to take a knife off her. Devon winds up getting cut and needs to go to the emergency room.
After getting stitches, Devon is sent home. And it seems that Kiri's desperate move has touched Devon's heart.
Carrie and Devon actually do seem to reconnect.
After all the back and forth, Devon now seems ready to forget about Michelle once and for all.
I think once Devon came back, she realized that she wanted to be with Carrie. I think she thought that she would be happier with Carrie. I think it would be a little less drama. I really, truly believe that Devon didn't want to mess up Michelle's marriage.
I just want to be with you. Promise.
And Devon isn't the only one having a change of heart. Since coming back from her romantic trip with Devon, Michelle has been under pressure from her family to reconcile with her husband.
Michelle was home with Brandon trying to fix what she just did.
Brandon is furious that his wife ran off with another woman and stole his credit cards. But despite all that, he forgives her and takes her back.
He loves her, and I believe he truly does love her, to the point where he's willing to forgive all these indiscretions and this affair with Devon and anything else, as long as she would commit to him.
By early June 2000, Michelle and Brandon are rebuilding their young marriage. And Devon and Kiri are making a fresh start. After months apart, there are even signs that all four of them are willing to let bygones be bygones. But within days, that hopeful dream will be violently shattered. In the early hours of June 15th, Michelle makes a panicked phone call to Kiri.
Michelle gets in contact with Carrie and says, hey, you know, where's Devon at? Where is she? Is she with you?
Michelle saw Devon the night before, but hasn't been able to reach her since.
She's looking around for her. She's calling, you know, is she there?
Kiri says Devon dropped her at home last night, but she then went back out.
Carrie is not worried. She knows Devon is sort of a free spirit and sometimes goes off on her own, and she shows up, you know, hours later, a day later, whatever. Carrie's not overly concerned.
But Michelle is, and Kiri's calm reaction on the other end of the line only makes her more frantic.
What if something's wrong? Like, what if Devon's hurt?
Michelle is hysterical, says we have to call the police because we don't know where Devon is. She's missing.
But Kiri refuses to call the cops. So minutes later, Michelle takes matters into her own hands.
Michelle goes to Carrie and Devon's apartment and says, where is she? We have to file a missing person report.
I think we have to call the police. What? No. I already told
Kiri,
you.
you're not listening.
I'm not going to call the police.
Carrie is not at all concerned about Devon. I mean, this is the person who just ran off a few weeks ago. You know, it's not the first time she's run off.
The situation gets more complicated when Kiri tells Michelle that 19-year-old Devon had been drinking the night before. She doesn't want to involve the police.
Carrie is very adamant not to do it. She goes, because if she gets pulled over, she's underage and she's going to be drunk and she'll just be mad at both of us.
Fine. I'll do it.
When Carrie refuses to call, Michelle actually does it.
I need to report a missing person.
But the detective Michelle talks to has some bad news. A person needs to be gone for at least 24 hours to be considered missing. And Devon was last seen only a few hours earlier. Michelle isn't willing to wait and decides to launch her own search, demanding that Kiri help her.
Michelle's driving her vehicle. Kiri is a passenger. They're driving around and going to what Michelle described as maybe some spots that Devin might have frequented.
The girls drive all morning, and just when they're about to give up,
It looks like her car.
they spot Devin's car.
Yeah, that is her car.
Carrie gets out and she looks in the car and she sees that she's laying down sort of in a fetal position in the back seat.
It looks like Kiri has been right all along. Devin has passed out after drinking too much.
Carrie believes she's sleeping, so she tries to wake her up.
Devin!
She doesn't move.
Hey.
And then I think they start to realize that something's wrong.
Wake up. Oh my God.
The girls turn Devin onto her front and make a horrifying discovery. Their friend's throat has been viciously slashed to the bone. It's June 2000, and Devin is in the middle of a volatile love triangle with her lover, Michelle, and her girlfriend, Kiri. When she goes missing, Kiri assumes she's just off partying as usual. But now, Devin has been found, lying dead in the back of her car. A passerby alerts police, and cops quickly arrive on the scene.
When they got there, they recognized immediately that they had a deceased person.
Devin Guzman is pronounced dead at the age of 19. Cops study the crime scene for clues as to what might have happened. At first glance, it looks like drugs might be to blame.
Her arm was covered at that point with a needle in it.
Cops theorize that high on drugs, Devin may have taken her own life.
She has in her hand a knife, which leads some to believe that perhaps she killed herself.
But the severity of her wounds make that seem impossible.
I was there when they physically removed the body from the vehicle and placed Devin's body on a mat outside the vehicle. And her neck sort of fell backwards, almost to the extent that I thought that she may have been decapitated. A gashing wound across her throat, which was deep. It was very visible. It was pretty clear that this was not a suicide.
That type of wound is not committed randomly. It's committed during a passionate crime. And this was definitely a crime of passion.
With Devin's death now confirmed as a homicide, police discover another vital piece of information.
This gaping wound to her neck would have caused a lot of arterial spurting, and there's very little blood in the car. It's obviously staged scene. This isn't where she was killed.
Not only that, but it's clear that Devin didn't die easily.
When you inspected Devin's body, you began seeing little cuts and bruises and dirt on her clothing and, blades of grass and hairs and fibers. So it was obvious there was some sort of violent struggle that preceded her death.
That same afternoon, investigators bring Michelle Hetzel down to the police station for questioning.
Michelle was pretty consistent with her version of events. When she spoke to Easton Police, she relayed that she was friends with Devin. Devin had been at her home earlier in the evening and then left to go take Kiri home, and that was the last that she saw her.
Michelle admitted that her and Devin had had a relationship, but said that they hadn't slept together or weren't intimate in several years. They may have hugged and kissed here or there or occasionally lately, but kind of downplayed the extent of their relationship.
Michelle tells cops that Devin was back with Kiri, although recently, things between them hadn't been going well.
She pointed out an incident that had happened a couple weeks prior where they were having an argument, and Kiri threatened to harm herself with a knife, and when Devin went to take it off her, that Devin got cut and had to go to the emergency room for treatment.
Did Devin's jealous girlfriend reach for her knife again, this time to kill her lover? Carrie is unable to give a statement that night, so police turn their attention to the final member of the foursome, Brandon.
Brandon basically corroborates everything that Michelle says, that, that they were over there, but that he didn't see them again.
Could he have decided to get rid of his wife's lover once and for all? The next morning, June 16th, police bring Carrie in to listen to her version of events.
Carrie was scared. I think Carrie realized that she may be a suspect, but she always maintained that she never would bring any harm to Devin.
We were arguing that night.
Carrie confirms Michelle's story that earlier in the evening, the two couples had gotten together, and that later on, she'd left with Devin.
We do have conflicting stories. Carrie claims that Devin dropped her off and was on her way back to the Michelle-Brandon home. Michelle denies that they ever saw Devin show up again.
She's like a sister.
Did something happen at Carrie and Devin's apartment? Did it happen down at Michelle and Brandon's house? Did it happen somewhere in between?
The next day, June 17th, police obtain a search warrant for Devin and Carrie's apartment.
There's broken furniture, there's articles of clothing and paper and objects strewn about the place. It's just an absolute mess.
The cops move into the bathroom in their search for evidence.
When we got to the bathroom area, there was a shower stall in there. And when we pulled the curtain back, there's a mat from Devin's car in the shower stall.
We find the car mat in the shower with what we thought was blood. And Carrie tells us that it was beet juice. It sounded like it was a little hard to believe. I'm thinking, there's blood on here, and she's trying to figure out a way to get out of this.
Police find further traces of blood in the shower stall, and DNA tests show those belong to Devin.
It's circumstantial evidence that, the murder could have been committed there.
The murder investigation is barely a day old, but police already have a prime suspect.
We find what we believe to be blood in the shower. So, at that point in time, we really, really think that there's a good chance that Carrie could have killed Devin.
Police still have no hard evidence on which to charge Carrie, but later that day, they receive a phone call. A young man named George has heard about the investigation and believes he has information that will help.
We wound up getting a tip from a male who was a friend with all three girls, Michelle, Devin, and Carrie. They were all at his house. And Carrie and Devin had gotten into an argument.
But George doesn't end there.
Yes.
What he says next will reveal the sinister truth behind this twisted teen love story. 19-year-old Devin Guzman has been involved in an intensely passionate affair with fellow teen Michelle Hetzel, despite the fact that Michelle's married and Devin has a serious girlfriend. When Devin is found with her throat slashed to the bone, the prime suspect is her girlfriend, Carrie.
The last known person to see Devin alive was Carrie. So when you add that all up, we're still looking at her.
But now a phone tip is shedding new light on who really wanted Devin dead.
Homicide.
A young man named George says all three girls were at his house a few days before the murder. Devin and Carrie left, but Michelle stayed behind to talk to him, and she makes a shocking request.
Michelle broaches the subject of trying to recruit him to help kill Devin. and dispose of the body, promising either money or sex or both.
She wanted you to help her kill Devin. Now, why would she do that?
When you receive information like that, it now puts the brakes on Carrie. It now opens up another window of a potential suspect in Michelle.
Investigators have no explanation for why Michelle would want her lover dead. That is about to change. Police obtain a search warrant for the apartment Michelle shares with her new husband, Brandon.
Nothing out of the ordinary initially. However, in the washing machine, they find a pair of jeans that are soaking.
The jeans belong to Michelle.
And when they take the jeans out, wring them out and package them up, turns out there's a syringe cap in the pocket.
Detectives have discovered a critical piece of evidence linking Michelle to Devin's death.
The significance of the syringe cap is that there was a syringe placed in Devin's arm in the back of the car.
Police continue searching around Michelle's house and her property, looking for further evidence to tie her to the murder.
Eventually, the police get a search warrant for Michelle's vehicle. When the trunk of Michelle's vehicle was opened, in the trunk was a paper bag, and in that paper bag were clothes.
On closer inspection, the police find tiny specks of an unidentified liquid. It's human blood.
It was a huge moment because now we had blood, and of course our next step was to see whether we could get DNA to match the blood, find out if this is the victim's blood or not.
The lab results come back. It's Devin's blood. But there's still one final twist that will throw everyone for a loop. This pair of jeans doesn't belong to Michelle.
They were determined to be Brandon's clothes.
This was a very significant event in this investigation. We had not strongly looked at Brandon at all. Most of the focus at that point in time was with Carrie. I mean, this was the smoking gun. So now the tide's turning towards Brandon and Michelle.
When Brandon is brought back in for questioning by police, they notice a deeply disturbing bruise on his arm.
When we were searching Brandon, we wound up finding a wound on his left forearm. Because it was so many days after, obviously it didn't look as it did the night the injury was inflicted.
The pattern appeared that it was in the shape of a mouth, and that it could have came from a bite injury.
Devin's body is exhumed, and the bite marks on Brandon's arm are confirmed to be the impression from her teeth.
When we see that Brandon's got this bite mark, we're starting to formulate a theory of what had occurred. We believe that probably Devin bit him while she was being killed.
The bite mark, along with the syringe and the blood-stained jeans, are enough for police to bring charges. And on August 13th, Brandon and Michelle are both arrested for Devin's murder. On September 25th, 2001, the case against Michelle and Brandon goes to trial. The prosecution puts forward its version of what happened to Devin Guzman.
We believe that on the night leading up to the murder, Devin had told Michelle that she wasn't going to move in with her, that she wasn't going through with this marriage. She was going to give her the rings back, and that she was going to stay with Carrie. That infuriated Michelle.
Devin then leaves, but the prosecution maintains that a little while later, Brandon calls Devin to come back. When she returns, she's not alone.
Whoa, what is she doing here?
Devin showed up with Carrie. They didn't want Carrie there. So Devin had to take Carrie back home to Mineral Springs, then drive back to the Brandon-Michelle home.
Hey.
This time, when she arrives, she's grabbed by Michelle and Brandon, who launch a vicious and deadly attack.
I think Brandon's the one who certainly cut her throat, but with the bruises on Devin's forearms, I think Michelle was right there. holding her arms so Brandon could do this thing.
Brandon was taller than Devin. He was stronger than Devin. This required a great amount of strength to commit this injury. He had the bite mark on his arm, which probably occurred while he was putting his arm around her throat.
She was then placed in her own vehicle in the back seat. They planted the syringe and the knife to make it look like perhaps it was a suicide.
Further tests reveal the blood found in Devin's shower and on the car mat is not from her murder.
Later, it was determined that blood presence on that mat could have been explained away as menstrual blood.
And Carrie is cleared of all charges, proving her innocence. 19-year-old Michelle Hetzel is found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury believes that Devin wanted to end the relationship with Michelle for good, but her scorned lover wouldn't take no for an answer.
Michelle was somebody who wanted, to control Devin. It became apparent that when Michelle couldn't have her, she was one of these people that if she couldn't have it, nobody would.
The prosecution believes that Michelle then roped Brandon in to help kill Devin.
I think somehow she convinced him that if Devin was out of the way, he would never have another problem and they'd live happily ever after.
I think Brandon was a follower. Michelle was the leader, and Brandon would have done anything that she asked him to do.
He is also found guilty of first-degree murder. It's a tragic end to a tortured story of teenage obsession.
My daughter was special. To me, she was very special. I wouldn't take away those 19 years for anything. She was a good human being and didn't deserve to be taken away from us.
The Pacific Ocean in the bitter winter months of 1787 was not merely a vast body of water. It was a boundless, indifferent void that swallowed the ambitions of empires and the sanity of men. For the crew aboard the French naval vessels Boussole and Astrolabe, the horizon had long since transformed into a psychological prison. Day after agonizing day, week after relentless week, the endless expanse of deep, unyielding blue offered nothing but the reflection of their own escalating mortality. The salt hung heavy and abrasive in the stifling tropical air, crusting over the intricate rigging, slowly eating away at the treated timber of the hulls, and parching the throats of the sailors, soldiers, and scientists who had been entirely isolated from the known world for more than 2 years. They represented the absolute pinnacle of the French crown, the highly educated tip of the spear in a grand, global geopolitical competition, yet in the overwhelming vastness of the Pacific, they were reduced to fragile creatures entirely at the mercy of the elements. The origin of their profound suffering traced back to the opulent, gilded halls of Versailles in the year 1785. King Louis XVI, watching with mounting anxiety the rapid expansion of British maritime dominance under the legendary navigator James Cook, had demanded a resolute response. The French expedition was carefully conceived not as a blunt act of war, but as a monumental, sweeping assertion of scientific, navigational, and imperial supremacy. The king had personally selected Jean-François de Gallup, the esteemed Comte de La Pérouse, a man of profound intellect, steady temperament, and extensive maritime experience, to serve as the supreme commander of the voyage. To captain the secondary vessel, the Astrolabe, La Pérouse relied implicitly upon Paul-Antoine Fleuriot de Langley, a highly experienced and fiercely dedicated naval officer known for his rigorous discipline and intense devotion to the mission's success. Together, these two men were tasked with a seemingly impossible mandate: to chart the uncharted corners of the globe, to observe the unobserved phenomena of nature, and to return to the harbors of France with a wealth of geographical and scientific knowledge that would utterly eclipse the formidable achievements of their British rivals. They carried with them the heavy, suffocating burden of national pride, setting sail with grand visions of peaceful discovery and the enlightened expansion of human understanding. But the harsh reality of an 18th-century global circumnavigation cared very little for the noble intentions of monarchs or the meticulous, ink-drawn planning of admiralty boards. By the twilight months of 1787, the initial glory and triumph of their departure had been entirely eroded by the brutal, unrelenting realities of deep-sea survival. The ships themselves, once pristine and formidable feats of naval engineering, were now heavily scarred by violent storms and bleached by the unforgiving equatorial sun. Below the main decks, the atmosphere had devolved into a suffocating, noxious blend of damp, rotting wood, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, sour tang of human desperation. The most critical, immediate crisis facing the expedition was not the threat of hostile navies or uncharted, jagged reefs, but the fundamental, unyielding biological necessity of fresh water. The massive, iron-hooped wooden casks stored deep within the cavernous holds of the Boussole and Astrolabe, which were meant to sustain the crew across thousands of miles of empty ocean, had reached dangerously low, critical levels. What little water remained at the bottom of these barrels was stagnant, foul-smelling, and barely suitable for human consumption, yet it was rationed with an aggressive, almost violent paranoia. Every single drop distributed among the men represented a fraction of a day's continued survival, a liquid currency far more valuable than the gold stowed in the captain's quarters. Compounding the agonizing, ever-present thirst was the silent, creeping devastation of scurvy. Before the modern medical understanding of vitamin C deficiency, this insidious disease was the absolute apex predator of long-haul mariners, triggering a slow, humiliating, and excruciating breakdown of the human body. Among the men of the Boussole and Astrolabe, the symptoms had rapidly progressed from isolated complaints of joint stiffness and fatigue to a widespread, inescapable reality that haunted every corner of the ships. Their physical deterioration was profound, visible, and horrifying. Gums blackened, swelled, and rotted, making the simple, necessary act of chewing an absolute agony. Teeth loosened in their sockets, frequently falling out during meager meals. Skin bruised violently at the absolute slightest touch, taking on a sickly, pallid, almost translucent hue, while old, long-healed scars, some decades old, spontaneously broke open and began to seep and bleed anew as the body's connective tissues literally dissolved. Men who had once climbed the towering, swaying masts with the fearless agility of acrobats now struggled merely to stand upright on the deck, their joints aching with a deep, systemic, fiery inflammation, their muscles wasting away beneath their salt-stained uniforms. A profound, crushing lethargy settled over the vessels, a deep, depressive exhaustion that stripped away all military morale and discipline, leaving only the raw, primal, animalistic instinct to survive another day. They were no longer merely proud explorers representing the Enlightenment. They were a collective of dying men, desperately scanning the horizon for the salvation that only solid Earth could provide. It is absolutely crucial to understand this agonizing physical and psychological state to fully comprehend the tragic sequence of events that were about to unfold. The men of the French expedition were operating at the absolute, frayed limits of human physical endurance and mental stability. Their cognitive faculties were dulled by constant pain, their judgment severely clouded by an overwhelming, singular, blinding desperation for fresh water and the vital, life-saving nutrients of fresh terrestrial vegetation. Every single decision made, every risk calculated during this critical period, was viewed exclusively through the highly distorted, narrow lens of pure survival. They did not, and could not, approach the unknown territories ahead with the calm, measured, objective curiosity of scientists, but rather with the frantic, reckless urgency of the starving and the parched. Then, finally, a break in the endless, monotonous blue. The lookout's hoarse cry from the crow's nest shattered the repetitive, hypnotic rhythm of the waves crashing against the hull. Rising slowly from the dense ocean mist, cutting sharply through the haze of the distant horizon, were the striking, volcanic peaks of the Navigator Islands, the lush archipelago known today as Samoa. For the wretched French crews, the mere sight of land was nothing short of a miraculous divine intervention. The vibrant, deep emerald green of the dense tropical canopy spilling down the rugged mountain slopes was a silent, beautiful promise of life, providing a vivid, almost painful contrast to the decaying, bleak environment of their wooden floating prisons. The Navigator Islands represented everything they had been agonizingly deprived of for months: cool shade, stable solid ground, fresh food, and most importantly, the prospect of clear, running streams of sweet, life-saving fresh water. The psychological relief sweeping through the ships was palpable, a sudden surge of adrenaline and hope that masked the severe physical decay of the crew. However, this island paradise was not an empty, unclaimed wilderness patiently waiting to be discovered and utilized by European voyagers. It was a deeply structured, fiercely territorial, and densely populated society, inhabited by a proud people who had thrived in these specific islands for countless generations. The Samoans possessed an intricate, highly developed culture, strictly governed by ancient oral traditions, complex hierarchical protocols, and a profound, sacred, unbreakable connection to their land, their waters, and their resources. They were a formidable warrior society, bound together by a complex system of chiefly authority known as the Matai system, where every single stream, every stretch of sandy beach, and every grove of fruit-bearing trees was woven into a rigid, non-negotiable fabric of ownership, mutual respect, and deep spiritual significance. The sudden, unannounced arrival of massive, alien, towering wooden vessels off their pristine shores was an event of cosmic, disruptive proportions, immediately triggering a rapid, highly organized mobilization of curiosity, extreme caution, and intense defensive readiness across all the coastal villages. As the Bussole and Astrolabe cautiously, slowly navigated the treacherous coastal waters of Tutuila in the fading, golden light of early December, two entirely different, diametrically opposed worlds were placed on an unavoidable collision course. On one side, a sophisticated indigenous civilization, deeply rooted in the absolute concept of sacred boundaries and the strict necessity of proper diplomatic protocol, silently observing the arrival of incomprehensible, heavily armed strangers. On the other side, an exhausted, desperate, physically ruined collective of European sailors, driven to the very edge of madness by an unquenchable thirst and a rotting disease, viewing the sovereign island not as a complex nation requiring respect, but simply as a desperately needed, immediate supply depot. The French possessed advanced flintlock firearms, heavy naval artillery, and a deeply ingrained, unquestioned belief in their own cultural and technological superiority, yet they were physically broken, outnumbered, and deeply vulnerable. The Samoans possessed overwhelming local numbers, absolute home ground advantage, and a fierce, unyielding dedication to protecting their sacred domain from unauthorized exploitation or invasion. The stage was perfectly, tragically, and irreversibly set. The immense, invisible pressures of European imperial ambition, the cruel, unforgiving biological realities of 18th-century sea travel, and the profound, impenetrable barrier of absolute cultural misunderstanding were rapidly converging on a single, isolated, beautiful point in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The desperate, animalistic need for water was about to fatally override the cautious, established protocols of peaceful exploration. The meticulous, grand plans of King Louis XVI and the genuinely peaceful, scientific intentions of Comte de la Pérouse were about to be violently shattered against the jagged, hidden coral reefs of Tutuila's northern coast. The men aboard the ships stared intently at the shoreline with hungry, hollow, desperate eyes, completely oblivious to the horrific reality that the salvation they so desperately sought would rapidly transform into a scene of unimaginable, chaotic bloodletting, forever etching the name of a serene island cove into the darkest, most violent annals of maritime history. The overwhelming thirst that blindly drove them toward the shore would not be quenched by the cool water of the island streams, but rather by a sudden, devastating, and fatal outpouring of blood upon the unforgiving coral sands. Paul-Antoine Fleuriet de Langley was not a man prone to reckless gambles or impulsive behavior. He was the quintessential product of the rigorous and demanding French Naval Academy system, an officer whose entire, distinguished career had been built upon a solid foundation of meticulous calculation, unwavering discipline, and an acute, ever-present understanding of maritime peril. As the captain of the Astrolabe, the secondary but equally vital vessel in this grand, globally ambitious expedition, he carried a monumental and crushing weight upon his shoulders. He was known throughout the entire French fleet for his incredibly steady hand and his highly analytical mind, traits that had served him exceptionally well during the arduous, perilous journey from the safe harbors of France to the uncharted, unpredictable vastness of the Pacific Ocean. De Langley was a man of profound science, just as much as he was a man of war, deeply invested in the intellectual and navigational ambitions of the voyage. He implicitly understood that their royal mission was not merely about traversing the globe to plant a flag, but about meticulously cataloging the world's hidden wonders, charting its unknown contours, and bringing the illuminating light of European knowledge to the darkest corners of the contemporary map. His devotion to duty, to his king, and to the scientific enlightenment was absolute, rendering the current, horrific state of his crew an unbearable, intensely personal torment that ate away at his normally unflappable composure. The men under his direct command were not just nameless, faceless sailors to him. They were his solemn responsibility, his extended maritime family, and he was being forced, day after agonizing day, to watch them slowly and painfully disintegrate before his very eyes. Among these suffering individuals was the celebrated and deeply respected naturalist Lamanon, a brilliant, inquisitive mind whose keen, detailed observations were supposed to enrich the prestigious scientific academies of Paris. Now, this great intellect was reduced to a fragile, shivering, suffering shadow of his former self, his body failing him completely. De Langley walked the creaking, salt-stained decks of the Astrolabe every single day, witnessing the horrific, uninterrupted progression of scurvy. He saw the blackened, immensely swollen gums, the teeth that loosened and fell out with the slightest pressure, the spontaneous reopening of ancient, long-forgotten battle wounds, and the profound, debilitating, soul-crushing lethargy that had ruthlessly stolen the vitality from his finest, strongest men. The agonizing, quiet groans that constantly echoed through the damp, stifling, foul-smelling wooden corridors below deck were a relentless, physical assault on his conscience. As a veteran commander, he had been extensively trained to navigate terrifying oceanic storms, to engage hostile enemy vessels in the heat of battle, and to chart courses using only the distant stars, but he found himself entirely, utterly powerless against the silent, insidious biological decay that was systematically destroying his loyal crew. This pervasive, inescapable suffering deeply and fundamentally eroded his usual stoic patience. The desperate, hollow, pleading stares of his dying men created an overwhelming, suffocating psychological pressure, slowly warping his typically flawless, cautious judgment and replacing his deeply ingrained methodical nature with an intense, burning, and ultimately dangerous urgency to find relief at absolutely any cost. On the 10th of December in the year of our Lord 1787, the agonizing, desperate prayers of the French expedition seemed to finally be answered as the massive wooden ships carefully and slowly navigated along the dramatic, heavily forested northern coastline of the island of Tutuila. It was here, amidst the towering, majestic volcanic cliffs and the dense, vibrant, seemingly impenetrable emerald canopy, that Captain de Langley's desperate, scanning eyes locked onto a specific geographical feature that promised immediate, miraculous salvation. Through the heavy, sea salt-encrusted brass of his spyglass, he identified a distinct, narrow indentation in the rugged, unforgiving coastline, a small, completely secluded bay that would soon be known to the world and to history as Asu. From the distant, relatively safe vantage point of the deep offshore water, the cove appeared as a breathtaking, idyllic, and perfectly peaceful sanctuary. A pristine, crystal-clear freshwater stream could be clearly seen cascading down from the lush, mountainous interior of the island, cutting a serpentine, silvery path through the vibrant green foliage before gently emptying into the shimmering, intensely turquoise embrace of the ocean. For the severely dehydrated and profoundly nutrient-starved crew, the sight of that pure, running, life-giving water was a mesmerizing, almost hallucinatory vision. It represented the immediate cessation of their prolonged physical agony, a vital, magical elixir that could instantly halt the ravages of their disease, soothe their parched throats, and restore crucial strength to their rapidly deteriorating bodies. The bay seemed, at first glance, to offer the perfect, naturally sheltered environment to anchor their smaller, maneuverable longboats and quickly, efficiently replenish their dangerously depleted, iron-hooped wooden casks. However, the breathtaking, lush beauty of Asa Bay was profoundly and fatally deceptive, masking a treacherous, complex, and highly unforgiving geographical reality that would soon prove disastrous. The cove was not an open, easily accessible, deep-water harbor, but rather a tight, restrictive, and highly dangerous bottleneck, heavily guarded by extensive, hidden, underwater networks of jagged, ancient coral reefs. These razor-sharp marine structures lay silently just a few feet beneath the surface of the undulating water, forming a massive, natural, submerged fortress entirely surrounding the entrance to the sandy beach. During the peak of the high tide, the rising ocean water level increased sufficiently to completely conceal these jagged, deadly hazards, allowing small, shallow-draft vessels to pass directly over them with a completely false and highly dangerous sense of security and navigational ease. But the vast Pacific Ocean is governed by relentless, powerful, and entirely predictable tidal shifts, and when the waters inevitably began to recede, the beautiful, inviting bay underwent a terrifying, drastic physical transformation. The gentle, welcoming cove would rapidly become a lethal, inescapable, rocky trap as the receding ocean exposed the massive, impassable walls of sharp, unyielding coral, completely cutting off the shallow inner beach from the deep, navigable, safe waters of the open sea. Any heavy, loaded wooden boat caught on the wrong side of the reef during the low tide would be instantly and firmly grounded, its wooden hull pinned securely against the unforgiving coral rock, rendering it entirely immobile and utterly isolating its occupants from any possibility of swift retreat, reinforcement, or rescue from the mother ships. This distinct, highly dangerous geographical reality was immediately recognized and deeply analyzed by the supreme commander of the entire expedition, the esteemed Comte de la Pérouse. Observing the narrow, reef-choked, constrained entrance to Asu from the commanding, elevated deck of his flagship, the Boussole, the highly experienced and deeply cautious La Pérouse felt a profound, instinctual sense of dread wash over him. He possessed a masterful, hard-won understanding of maritime topography and an acute, hypervigilant awareness of the catastrophic risks associated with landing heavily laden, vulnerable boats in such a physically constrained and totally unpredictable environment. His brilliant analytical mind quickly and grimly calculated the terrifying, compounding variables of the situation. He vividly envisioned the heavy wooden longboats, burdened with massive, immensely heavy water-filled casks and dozens of exhausted, physically weakened men, desperately attempting to navigate the treacherous, winding coral labyrinth precisely as the powerful ocean tide began its inevitable, rapid retreat. La Pérouse clearly recognized that the beautiful bay was essentially a natural, heavily fortified cage. If the expedition's smaller boats were to enter the cove and be subsequently stranded by the falling tide, the sailors and scientific officers would be completely, hopelessly cut off from the protective, heavy naval artillery mounted on the decks of the Boussole and Astrolabe. They would find themselves entirely trapped on a foreign, unmapped, heavily populated beach, utterly vulnerable to the unforgiving elements and any potential hostilities from the indigenous inhabitants, while the main ships, constrained by the deep water, would be utterly powerless to provide physical assistance, cover fire, or immediate evacuation. Consequently, prioritizing logic over emotion, Lapérouse firmly and decisively initially rejected the idea of attempting a landing at Asu, prioritizing the long-term safety and survival of his overall command over the immediate, yet incredibly perilous, access to the freshwater stream. It was precisely at this critical, monumental juncture in history that Captain de Langley's typically flawless, detached, and highly logical military judgment severely faltered, heavily compromised and ultimately broken by the unbearable, crushing weight of his crew's immense suffering. Driven by an intense, overriding, and deeply human compassion for his dying men and a fierce, almost irrational urgent desire to alleviate their terrible agony, he approached his supreme commander to directly challenge the strategic decision. The interaction between the two highly respected officers was not one of insubordination or anger, but rather an impassioned, deeply emotional, and profoundly desperate plea from a dedicated captain who could simply no longer bear to watch his maritime family perish in agony. De Langley vehemently argued that the geographical risk, while undeniably present and severe, was an absolutely necessary and entirely manageable gamble given their dire circumstances. He adamantly insisted that the pressing, critical, life-or-death need for fresh water far outweighed the physical hazards presented by the coral reefs of the narrow cove. Drawing heavily upon his extensive, decorated naval experience and his unwavering belief in the discipline of his men, he presented a rapid, highly structured, and seemingly flawless plan of action, confidently assuring the skeptical Lapérouse that a disciplined, well-coordinated, highly motivated team could quickly enter the bay, rapidly fill the massive wooden casks from the stream, and execute a complete, successful withdrawal back to the ships long before the receding tide could pose any fatal threat. He promised a surgical, rapid, military-style operation, a brief, highly focused incursion into the sheltered beach that would require only a very few short hours to completely execute. He essentially staked his esteemed, unblemished professional reputation and his considerable command authority on the absolute guarantee that he could personally manage the landing, secure the vital, life-saving resources, and return his men safely to the protective embrace of the astrolabe without any major incident or delay. In his profound, blinding desperation to save his dying crew, de Langley made a catastrophic, multi-layered, and ultimately fatal miscalculation. His usually methodical, deeply analytical mind drastically underestimated the complex, time-consuming, and physically demanding logistics of manually maneuvering heavy, incredibly cumbersome wooden longboats through unfamiliar, shallow, winding coral channels. He completely and tragically failed to adequately account for the severe, debilitating physical exhaustion of his own men, whose severely weakened, scurvy-ridden bodies would inevitably and significantly slow down the grueling, agonizing, back-breaking labor of hauling massive, heavy, waterlogged barrels across soft sand and treacherous, slippery, submerged rocks. Furthermore, and most tragically of all, he entirely and inexplicably neglected to consider the potential reaction, presence, or territorial rights of the local indigenous population. Completely blinded by the urgent, singular, all-consuming goal of securing fresh water for his dying men, de Langley viewed the pristine, beautiful cove of Asu merely as an empty, temporary natural resource depot, completely failing to recognize it as a sovereign, deeply sacred, and highly valued territory fiercely protected by a complex, proud, and heavily populated warrior society. He approached the impending landing not as a delicate, highly sensitive diplomatic encounter with an unknown, powerful civilization, but strictly as a rapid, desperate, logistical military maneuver to extract resources. This fundamental, devastating failure to perceive the intricate, human, and cultural element of the environment, combined with his gross, fatal underestimation of the physical challenges posed by the receding ocean tide, forged the irreversible, bloody path toward total disaster. His impassioned, Emotionally charged persuasion eventually wore down the highly cautious, logical resistance of La Perouse, finally securing the fateful, tragic authorization to proceed with the landing operation. The deadly die was cast, the pieces moved into place. A brilliant, dedicated, fiercely loyal, and highly experienced naval commander, driven entirely by love, duty, and overwhelming responsibility for his suffering crew, had unknowingly and meticulously set the stage for his own violent, gruesome demise and the tragic, completely avoidable slaughter of the very men he was so desperately, frantically trying to save. The morning of December the 11th dawned with a heavy, oppressive tropical humidity that clung desperately to the skin of the men descending into the 4 small wooden longboats. Captain de Langley stood resolute at the prow of the lead vessel, his eyes fixed intensely on the narrow, inviting aperture of the bay. 61 men accompanied him on this desperate mission, a fragile mix of seasoned sailors, armed Marines, and highly educated scientific officers, all bearing the undeniable, horrific physical scars of their agonizing oceanic isolation. They rowed with a desperate, rhythmic intensity, their wooden oars slicing through the crystalline, aquamarine water, propelling the heavy, barrel-laden boats toward the pristine crescent of white coral sand. Initially, as the wooden keels scraped gently against the shallow shore, the atmosphere was thick with a profound, almost surreal tranquility that completely masked the impending disaster. The Frenchmen disembarked slowly, their heavy leather boots sinking into the soft, welcoming earth, and immediately commenced a rudimentary, haphazard system of barter with the small cluster of indigenous inhabitants who had gathered at the water's edge. Tiny glass beads, polished mirrors, and rudimentary iron tools were nervously and clumsily exchanged for fresh coconuts, ripe tropical fruits, and the unspoken, assumed permission to inhabit the space. This early, fragile peace was a highly seductive illusion, a temporary calm masking the profound and catastrophic collision of realities that was already well underway. The French sailors, physically devastated by scurvy and mentally frayed by months of nautical confinement, viewed these initial transactions through a purely transactional and highly arrogant European lens, firmly believing they were successfully purchasing temporary dominion over the beach and its resources. Driven by intense dehydration, they almost immediately turned their attention completely away from the people and focused solely upon the cascading freshwater stream, their ultimate prize. What the French expedition completely and fatally failed to comprehend was the intricate, highly formalized, and deeply sacred socio-political architecture of the Samoan world they had just blindly stepped into. In this vibrant, highly structured indigenous society, land and natural resources were absolutely not mere commodities to be casually traded or exploited by passing strangers. Every single grain of sand, every leaf in the dense jungle canopy, and, crucially, every drop of the life-giving freshwater stream belonged entirely to the collective inheritance of the local villages, strictly governed under the absolute, divine authority of the Matai, the revered hereditary chiefs. The cultural concept of hospitality was paramount to the Samoan people, but it was rigidly dictated by ancient, unbreakable protocols of respect, formal introduction, and reciprocal acknowledgement of status and authority. By arrogantly bypassing the local leadership hierarchy, by completely failing to seek a formal audience with the ruling Matai to request explicit, ceremonial permission to draw from the ancestral waters, the French were unknowingly committing an egregious, deeply offensive cultural transgression of the highest order. To the silent, watchful Samoan observers, the sight of these pale, sickly, heavily armed foreigners marching directly to the sacred stream, plunging their massive, iron-hooped wooden casks into the pristine water without offering a single word of formal supplication or ritual respect, was an act of astonishing arrogance and profound desecration. The stream was the vital lifeblood of the community, a resource deeply interwoven with their spiritual identity and ancestral survival, and the French were carelessly treating it as an unowned, easily conquerable puddle. The native warriors, highly disciplined and fiercely protective of their ancestral domain, stood rigidly on the periphery of the beach, their initial, natural curiosity rapidly curdling into a cold, hardened, and highly dangerous indignation. They watched silently, their bodies adorned with intricate, symbolic tattoos denoting lineage and martial prowess, as the foreigners began their clumsy, agonizingly slow labor, dragging the heavy, waterlogged barrels across the uneven terrain. The psychological and cultural chasm between the two groups was absolute, vast, and utterly unbridgeable. As the grueling, backbreaking work progressed under the relentless, punishing glare of the equatorial sun, the demographics of the isolated beach began to undergo a rapid, terrifying transformation. The initial, small trickle of curious onlookers swelled into a massive, undulating, overwhelming tide of humanity. News of the alien visitors, with their bizarre metallic weapons, strange, heavy garments, and astonishing lack of basic cultural etiquette, had spread through the surrounding mountainous villages like a rapidly advancing wildfire. Hundreds, and then rapidly over 1,000 Samoan men, women, and children poured down from the lush, verdant interior, converging on the narrow, physically constrained geography of Asa Bay. The sheer physical presence of this immense, focused crowd was utterly overwhelming. The French sailors, already operating at the absolute, fragile limit of their diminished physical capacities due to their advanced illness, suddenly found themselves entirely surrounded, swallowed completely by a dense, pressing wall of unfamiliar faces and imposing physical forms. The Samoan warriors were robust, muscular, heavily built, and intimately adapted to their tropical environment, presenting a stark, highly intimidating contrast to the frail, trembling, severely malnourished Europeans who struggled simply to stand upright beneath the weight of the water casks. The humid air grew unimaginably thick with an intense, suffocating claustrophobia and the palpable, vibrating tension of 1,000 watchful eyes. Compounding this escalating psychological terror was the sudden, horrifying realization dawning upon the French commanding officers regarding the changing seascape behind them. Exactly as the Supreme Commander La Perouse had accurately and grimly feared from the safety of his distant flagship, the powerful ocean tide was rapidly and aggressively retreating. The 4 wooden longboats, initially floating comfortably and securely in the shallows, were now heavily laden with the massive, water-filled casks and were steadily, inexorably settling onto the jagged, unyielding crests of the submerged coral reef. The vital, umbilical connection to the safety of the deep, open sea was being severed, slowly and visibly, leaving the exhausted landing party entirely marooned, physically trapped on an increasingly hostile and intensely crowded shore. Panic, cold, sharp, and deeply rational, began to weave its way rapidly through the ranks of the disorganized French Marines. The critical, irreversible breaking point arrived not with the thunderous discharge of a firearm, but with a profoundly disastrous failure of physical discipline born of absolute, primal terror. The sheer density of the gathered Samoan crowd was creating an immense, crushing physical pressure against the fragile, disorganized, and rapidly shrinking French perimeter. The indigenous people, driven by an intense, natural curiosity about these strange interlopers and their bizarre, unfamiliar equipment, continued to press forward relentlessly, closing the physical distance step by step, their voices rising in a complex cacophony of overlapping, indecipherable dialects that only served to further disorient the panicked Europeans. Captain de Langley, acutely and painfully aware of the desperate vulnerability of his trapped men and the rapidly grounding boats, had issued strict, unequivocal, desperately urgent orders forbidding any soldier from discharging their heavy flintlock muskets under any circumstances, terrified that a single gunshot would instantly ignite a massive, uncontrollable slaughter. However, in his desperate attempt to maintain absolute fire discipline, he failed to account for the primal, overriding animal instinct of trapped, deeply frightened men who felt their lives were in imminent, unavoidable peril. Deprived of the ability to fire their weapons, but desperate to create a rudimentary buffer of physical safety between themselves and the overwhelming numbers surrounding them, a small group of exhausted, deeply panicked French Marines made a catastrophic, highly impulsive decision that would seal all their fates. Gripping their heavy, unloaded muskets firmly by the long metal barrels, they violently and aggressively thrust the thick, wooden, heavy brass-bound stocks forward, using them as crude, blunt instruments to aggressively push back the front line of the pressing Samoan crowd. They shoved forcefully and repeatedly against the broad chests and muscular shoulders of the imposing indigenous warriors, desperately attempting to forcibly carve out breathing room on the rapidly shrinking, chaotic beach. In the European military context, this was a desperate, rudimentary, and somewhat standard method of riot control and perimeter defense. In the strict, deeply honor-bound, proud warrior culture of 18th century Samoa, however, this physical, highly aggressive strike by an uninvited, highly disrespectful foreigner was absolutely not perceived as an act of desperate crowd control or defense, but rather as an unforgivable, highly aggressive physical assault. It was the ultimate, deeply personal insult, a blatant, undeniable, and deeply violent provocation that instantly severed any remaining, fragile threads of mutual restraint or peaceful observation. The act of physically striking a Samoan warrior, especially entirely without provocation or the formal, recognized declaration of grievance, was the absolute, universally understood, and irreversible declaration of war. The cacophony of the pressing crowd instantly ceased, replaced for a single, terrifying heartbeat by a profound, heavy, deadly silence, as the collective shock of the insult transformed immediately into a unified, explosive, and highly organized martial fury. The cultural misunderstanding had reached its absolute zenith. The time for observation and peaceful tolerance had violently ended, and the slaughter was now entirely inevitable. This catastrophic error in judgment, born of profound cultural ignorance and amplified by sheer physical terror, represented the ultimate, tragic culmination of two entirely incompatible worlds colliding in a confined space. The French Marines, viewing themselves merely as desperate men attempting to secure a few yards of breathing room to facilitate their escape, possessed absolutely no linguistic or cultural mechanism to comprehend the profound severity of their physical actions. They saw a threatening mob to be managed. The Samoans saw an arrogant invading force violently attacking their sovereign citizens on sacred ground after having stolen their vital resources. The heavy wooden stocks of the French muskets, striking against the flesh of the indigenous hosts, shattered the invisible, sacred boundary of peace that had barely held the situation together. Every single element of the encounter, the unauthorized taking of the water, the lack of deference to the chiefs, the sheer, unprecedented numbers of foreigners, and finally, the blatant physical assault, coalesced into a singular, irrefutable narrative for the thousands of Samoans present. These were not weary travelers seeking succor. These were hostile aggressors who fundamentally disrespected the land and its people, and who had now drawn the first blood, albeit bluntly, in a conflict of their own making. The humid air, previously thick with curiosity and apprehension, suddenly crackled with a unified, devastatingly clear martial intent. The French had unwittingly lit the fuse of a powder keg they did not even realize they were standing upon, their desperate struggle for basic survival blinding them completely to the highly complex, fiercely proud human landscape they had so clumsily decided to occupy. The consequences of this singular, violent push would echo through the centuries, transforming a desperate search for fresh water into one of the most violent, tragic, and historically significant encounters in the history of Pacific exploration. The stage was now completely set, not for a hasty, disorganized retreat, but for an overwhelming, brutal, and utterly uncompromising retribution that would stain the white coral sands of Asu red with the blood of two disparate civilizations. The defining moment of the Asa massacre, the exact fraction of a second where the fragile architecture of human restraint completely collapsed, was not heralded by a thunderous volley of European cannon fire or the organized, rhythmic chanting of a formal indigenous war cry. It began instead with the sudden, violent trajectory of a single, heavy volcanic stone, hurled with devastating precision from the dense, suffocating epicenter of the chaotic, pressing crowd. This solitary projectile, a raw fragment of the island itself, arced sharply through the humid, stagnant tropical air, and struck Captain Paul Antoine Fleuriot de Langley squarely in the center of his forehead. The sheer kinetic force of the impact was absolute and instantly catastrophic. The esteemed naval commander, a man whose brilliant, disciplined mind had successfully navigated heavily armed frigates across vast, uncharted oceans and meticulously negotiated complex, high-stakes diplomatic encounters across the globe, was entirely instantly neutralized by a weapon as ancient as humanity itself. He did not issue a final, desperate command. He did not raise a hand in a futile attempt at self-defense. He simply collapsed, his unconscious, severely traumatized body falling heavily backward over the low wooden gunwale of the grounded longboat, plunging violently into the shallow, crystalline, coral-strewn waters of the bay. In any formal criminal investigation, the fall of the leader marks the precise chronological origin point of total systemic failure, the exact moment the command structure is decapitated and panic irrevocably supersedes disciplined military doctrine. For the 60 severely weakened, deeply terrified French sailors and scientists completely surrounded on that shrinking, heavily contested beach, the sudden, horrific sight of their invincible commander sinking limply beneath the blood-stained surface of the water was the absolute psychological breaking point. The invisible, fragile dam of mutual apprehension had spectacularly burst, completely unleashing a tidal wave of sheer, unadulterated martial violence. What rapidly unfolded next on the pristine white sands of Asu Bay was not a battle in any traditional, recognized 18th-century European military sense, but rather a chaotic, terrifyingly intimate, and overwhelmingly one-sided slaughter. As a historical forensic analysis of the event reveals, the French expedition was immediately and fatally betrayed by the very technological superiority they had so arrogantly relied upon to guarantee their absolute safety. Captain de Langley's previous, highly disciplined and rigorously enforced orders forbidding the preemptive discharge of firearms, while originally intended to preserve peace, now proved to be a fatal, catastrophic tactical error. By the time the profoundly shocked and entirely desperate French Marines finally raised their heavy, cumbersome flintlock muskets to defend their fallen captain and their own rapidly expiring lives, the unforgiving environmental reality of the Pacific utterly destroyed their only remaining tactical advantage. In the frantic, disorganized chaos of the escalating melee, as men desperately wrestled in the shallow, turbulent surf, the delicate, highly sensitive firing mechanisms of their advanced weaponry had been repeatedly splashed and completely saturated by the salty ocean water. When the desperate, trembling fingers of the French soldiers finally pulled the metal triggers, expecting the deafening, authoritative, and life-saving roar of concentrated musket fire, they were met instead with a terrifying, pathetic series of hollow, metallic clicks. The gunpowder was entirely soaked, transformed into a useless, dark sludge. The most advanced, lethal military technology of the European Enlightenment had been instantly rendered entirely obsolete by a few droplets of seawater, transforming the heavy, useless muskets into nothing more than awkward, ineffective wooden clubs against a highly motivated, numerically overwhelming force of indigenous warriors who had spent their entire lives mastering the brutal, intimate art of close-quarters melee combat. The indigenous Samoan warriors, seizing upon this absolute, terrifying paralysis of their foreign adversaries, surged forward with a highly organized, devastating ferocity. They were armed not with complex machinery, but with deeply traditional, profoundly effective instruments of blunt force trauma and piercing damage. Heavy, meticulously carved wooden war clubs, lined with the razor-sharp teeth of marine predators, swung through the humid air with bone-crushing velocity. Rough-hewn wooden sickles and sharpened, lethal volcanic stones were wielded with terrifying, practiced efficiency. The shallow, pristine water surrounding the completely immobilized, heavily grounded wooden longboats rapidly transformed into a horrific, churning abattoir. Captain de Langley, still lying semi-conscious and entirely defenseless in the shallow surf, was immediately swarmed by the furious vanguard of the indigenous assault. Forensic reconstructions based on the traumatized testimonies of the few survivors paint a picture of absolute, unrestrained brutality. He was ruthlessly beaten with heavy stones and wooden clubs, his body suffering massive, unsurvivable blunt force trauma before he was violently dragged by his blood-soaked uniform onto the harsh coral sand, a grim, undeniable physical testament to the absolute failure of his command. Beside him, the brilliant, highly esteemed naturalist Lamanon, a man whose entire existence was wholly dedicated to the peaceful, objective, and enlightened observation of the natural world, met a similarly gruesome, terrifyingly violent end, his fragile, scurvy-ravaged body hacked and bludgeoned to death amidst the chaotic, screaming frenzy. 11 French sailors and esteemed scientific officers were systematically surrounded, isolated from the desperately retreating main group, and slaughtered where they stood, their blood utterly defiling the sacred, contested waters they had so desperately sought to claim. Simultaneously, exactly 1 mile away, entirely insulated from the deafening, horrific auditory reality of the massacre, the supreme commander of the expedition, the Comte de La Pérouse, stood rigidly on the elevated quarterdeck of his massive flagship, the Boussole. In the agonizing, highly sanitized context of historical criminal investigation, La Pérouse essentially served as the primary, yet entirely impotent, lead detective, forced to witness the brutal murder of his closest friends and colleagues in real time. He had desperately trained his heavy, brass-bound naval telescope onto the distant, narrow aperture of Ace Bay, deeply anxious regarding the rapidly falling tide and the profoundly dangerous delay of his landing party. Through the highly polished, circular glass lens of his optical instrument, he was suddenly subjected to a silent, horrifying, and deeply surreal visual nightmare. He could clearly see the massive, dark, undulating mass of the indigenous population violently swarming over the tiny, vulnerable, completely grounded wooden longboats. He watched, entirely paralyzed by a profound, suffocating horror, as tiny, frantic figures desperately threw themselves into the water, attempting to swim away from the chaotic, violent shoreline. He witnessed the brutal, rhythmic rising and falling of heavy wooden clubs, the unmistakable, terrifying visual signatures of a massacre unfolding in perfect, agonizing miniature. This was the ultimate, cruelest twist of the entire agonizing narrative. La Pérouse possessed the overwhelming, devastating, and world-shattering firepower of an entire heavily armed French naval squadron. He could have easily ordered his massive cannons to unleash a devastating, indiscriminate bombardment of explosive iron shells and lethal grapeshot upon the crowded beach, completely obliterating the indigenous attackers and transforming the lush, vibrant shoreline into a burning, desolate wasteland in a matter of terrible minutes. Yet, as the Supreme Commander agonizingly processed the horrifying visual evidence rapidly unfolding through his spyglass, he found himself utterly, tragically paralyzed by the complex, demanding ethical constraints of his enlightened mission and the brutal, unforgiving tactical realities of his immediate situation. The profound, agonizing twist in La Pérouse's internal, real-time investigation of the disaster was the sudden, crushing realization of his own absolute helplessness. If he ordered the heavy naval artillery to fire upon the beach, he would undeniably massacre hundreds, perhaps thousands, of entirely innocent men, women, and children who were simply caught in the massive, chaotic throng, completely violating the strict, peaceful, and enlightened directives explicitly issued to him by King Louis XVI. Furthermore, and perhaps even more terrifyingly from a purely tactical perspective, unleashing such a devastating, indiscriminate bombardment would virtually guarantee the immediate, retaliatory slaughter of every single surviving French sailor currently desperately fighting for their lives in the surf. He was forced to stand there, a highly decorated, immensely powerful military commander, completely impotent, his hands gripping the cold brass rail of his flagship so tightly his knuckles turned white, silently absorbing the agonizing visual evidence of his expedition's catastrophic, irreversible failure. He was trapped in a terrible, impossible paradox. To use his immense power would be a horrific crime against humanity, but to withhold it meant passively accepting the brutal murder of his own men. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter, the desperate, chaotic extraction of the survivors served as the frantic, disorganized gathering of witness testimony that would ultimately piece together the tragic narrative of the event. 49 heavily bleeding, profoundly traumatized, and deeply exhausted men managed to physically tear themselves away from the brutal, close-quarters massacre. Driven by the absolute, primal instinct for survival, they threw themselves violently into the deeper, slightly safer waters of the bay, desperately swimming toward the two remaining, heavily overloaded small boats that had miraculously managed to avoid becoming completely trapped on the treacherous, jagged coral reef. In a final, desperate, and terrifyingly chaotic attempt to cover their chaotic retreat, the surviving French Marines managed to successfully prime and fire a handful of muskets that had somehow remained dry amidst the carnage. These desperate, uncoordinated parting shots, fired blindly into the dense, pursuing mass of indigenous warriors, found their mark with devastating, lethal effect, abruptly ending the lives of 39 Samoan men. This desperate, bloody, and entirely futile exchange of violence perfectly encapsulated the absolute, catastrophic breakdown of all communication. As the two severely overloaded boats finally rowed desperately out of the narrow bay and slowly approached the towering wooden hulls of the Bussel and Astrolabe, they resembled floating charnel houses. The deeply wounded, heavily bleeding men were frantically hoisted onto the main deck, their uniforms completely soaked in blood and seawater, their bodies severely battered, bruised, and broken. It was here, amidst the desperate, chaotic medical triage and the agonizing, grief-stricken cries of the wounded, that Laperouse finally conducted his grim, heartbreaking investigation, painstakingly piecing together the chaotic, fragmented testimonies of his deeply traumatized men to understand the precise mechanics of the disaster. The horrific, unavoidable truth that slowly and painfully emerged from the blood-soaked deck of the flagship was a devastating, deeply psychological twist that would haunt the French commander for the remainder of his life. The massacre at Asu was not a premeditated, malicious ambush cunningly orchestrated by a fundamentally hostile, inherently violent indigenous population. It was, tragically and undeniably, the direct, unavoidable consequence of a catastrophic, cascading series of European failures. It was the desperate, unauthorized theft of sacred resources. It was the gross, fatal underestimation of the powerful, unforgiving oceanic tides. And finally, most tragically, it was the violently impulsive, culturally ignorant shove of a heavy wooden musket stock against a proud, deeply traditional indigenous warrior. The investigation concluded with a chilling, indisputable fact. The French expedition, entirely blinded by their own profound desperation and deeply ingrained cultural arrogance, had unwittingly, yet meticulously, constructed the very terrifying, bloody trap that ultimately destroyed them. They had sailed halfway across the known world, seeking to illuminate the darkest corners of the globe, only to be utterly consumed by the catastrophic, violent consequences of their own profound, deeply human ignorance. The aftermath of the bloodshed at Asu Bay was not marked by the immediate, cold, and systematic mechanism of a formal judicial trial, but rather by a profound, agonizingly heavy silence that descended upon the ships as they stood anchored off the blood-stained coast of Tutuila. In the absence of a terrestrial courtroom, the decks of the Bussel and Astrolabe functioned as the site of a final, solemn reckoning, an immediate, internal assessment of the catastrophic failure that had decimated the expedition's leadership and morale. There were no robed judges to interpret the law, no advocates to argue mitigating factors, and no formal jury to deliver a verdict on the events that had transpired in the shallow, coral-choked waters. Instead, the judgment was rendered through the cold, objective tallying of the lost. 12 of the finest men in the French Navy, including the esteemed Captain de Langley and the brilliant naturalist Lamenon, were gone, their lives extinguished in a matter of terrible, unrecoverable minutes. This was a tragedy of immense proportions, a loss not just of manpower, but of the expedition's very soul and intellectual capacity, and the gravity of this reality hung over the surviving crew like a thick, impenetrable shroud of grief and unresolved, festering guilt. La Perouse, now serving as the sole authority in this maritime void, was forced to assume the role of the investigator, the judge, and the mourner all at once. He meticulously gathered the testimonies of the 49 survivors, sitting them down in the dim, lantern-lit confines of his cabin, listening with a leaden heart as they recounted the sequence of events with broken, trembling voices. There was no denial, no attempt to shift blame onto an unseen, cunning adversary. The narrative that emerged was one of profound, systemic human error, a series of compounding, fatal miscalculations that had inexorably led to the slaughter. The investigation revealed that the primary culpability for the disaster could not be pinned to a single individual, nor could it be attributed to a malicious external force. Instead, it was found in the fatal intersection of dire physiological necessity and a complete, catastrophic failure of cultural translation. The men had been driven by the crushing, distorting pressures of advanced scurvy and profound, soul-ravaging dehydration, and in that desperate state, they had looked at the sacred stream of Asu and seen only a resource to be extracted, failing utterly to perceive the spiritual and territorial significance it held for the Samoan people. The internal inquiry, conducted in the somber atmosphere of the flagship, reached a conclusion that was perhaps more difficult for La Perouse to bear than the prospect of a traditional trial. He arrived at the grim realization that the French expedition had been, in every practical sense, the aggressor in this conflict. By failing to seek the formal, ritualistic permission of the local Matai, by treating the beach as an unclaimed territory, and by allowing the panicked, impulsive physical assault of an indigenous warrior to occur, the French had essentially forfeited their right to diplomatic protection. The evidence was damning in its simplicity. A series of avoidable, culturally arrogant actions had provoked an equally decisive, swift, and brutal indigenous reaction. There was no legal recourse in this distant, sovereign corner of the Pacific, and the expedition lacked the remaining strength, resources, or political authority to engage in any form of retribution. La Perouse's judgment, therefore, was not one of sentencing, but of profound, introspective resignation. He recognized that there would be no justice for the fallen, no reparations for the families back in France, and no sense of closure for the surviving men who carried the psychic scars of the massacre. The absence of a formal trial did not, however, mean that there was no sense of accountability. The surviving crew, haunted by the images of their comrades falling beneath the surf, lived in a state of deep, collective trauma that acted as its own form of sentencing. They were stripped of their pride, their belief in their own superiority, and their confidence in the mission. The trial they faced was one of conscience, occurring every time they walked the deck and saw the empty hammocks of the men who had been hacked down in the shallows. The verdict was a permanent, lingering awareness of their own fragility and the devastating cost of their ignorance. The lack of a formal judicial conclusion in the traditional sense only deepened the tragedy, leaving the event as an open, festering wound in the narrative of the expedition. They were forced to carry the weight of the massacre without the palliative release of a public reckoning or the symbolic resolution provided by a legal decree. As the ships prepared to weigh anchor and depart from the cursed, beautiful bay, the atmosphere was one of a quiet, mournful evacuation rather than a strategic retreat. There was no intent to return, no desire to settle the score, and no interest in further engagement with the people of Tutuila. The reality of the slaughter had fundamentally changed the nature of the entire voyage. The expedition, once a grand, outward-looking project of enlightened expansion, had turned inward, becoming a desperate, singular journey toward survival. La Perouse, the man who had been tasked by the king to map the world, now saw the world through the lens of a devastating personal failure. He had witnessed the ultimate limit of his power. He had stood on the deck, master of 2 formidable warships, and had watched his closest friends perish because of a fundamental, fatal inability to understand the people he had been sent to observe. This failure of communication, this absolute collapse of empathy, served as the ultimate trial for the expedition. They were judged by the unforgiving standards of their own humanity, and they were found wanting. The formal, colonial, and imperial structures of the 18th century provided no framework for acknowledging this, and thus, the event remained a haunting, unresolved contradiction in the records of the voyage. The investigation into the massacre at Asu thus became an investigation into the limitations of the Enlightenment itself. It posed a difficult, uncomfortable question. How could a nation that claimed to be the pinnacle of scientific progress and rational thought so completely and utterly fail to recognize the fundamental humanity of those it encountered? The departure from the coast of Tutuila was a somber, silent affair, the only sound being the rhythmic clanking of the anchor chain and the mournful creaking of the ship's timber as it caught the wind. The men stood at the rails, their gazes fixed on the receding, lush, and dangerous shoreline, each lost in their own private, silent trial of the past 2 days. There was no talk of vengeance, no talk of the heathens or the savages who had perpetrated the act. There was only a chilling, universal recognition of the blood that had been shed and the irreparable damage done to their collective purpose. The massacre had stripped away the facade of the mission, leaving them with the raw, brutal reality of their own vulnerability. The trial was over, the verdict was silent, and the expedition, now forever diminished, turned its sails away from the island and toward the vast, empty, and indifferent expanse of the Pacific, carrying the heavy, haunting ghosts of Asu with them into the unknown. In the final accounting of the event, the trial was not a legal proceeding in a courtroom, but the very process of surviving the immediate aftermath and deciding how to continue the voyage. The decision to abandon any attempt at retaliation, to treat the event as a catastrophic failure of their own design rather than a crime committed against them, was perhaps the only moment of true, cold, analytical clarity that remained for La Perouse. By refusing to engage in further violence, he implicitly accepted the failure of the expedition's original, enlightened mandate. He acknowledged that the French were not merely observers of the world, but were active, fallible participants whose mere presence could cause as much destruction as the most violent storm. This realization was the true, final outcome of the inquiry, a profound, devastating loss of innocence that ensured the remainder of their journey would be shadowed by the memory of the 11 men they had left behind on the coral sands of Asu Bay. The record of the incident was closed not with a gavel, but with the turning of a page, as the ships vanished into the vast, blue, and uncaring horizon, leaving behind only the echo of the tragedy and the silent, unceasing testimony of the sea. The legacy of the massacre at Asu Bay is a haunting, discordant melody that continues to resonate through the history of Pacific exploration, a testament to the catastrophic price paid when the grand, enlightened ambitions of a distant European empire violently collide with the sacred, unyielding reality of an indigenous sovereignty. As the Boussole and the Astrolabe finally vanished into the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific, they did not merely carry away the surviving crew and their physical cargo, they bore the heavy, permanent burden of a shattered paradigm. The expedition had set sail with the explicit, optimistic mandate to observe, categorize, and intellectually conquer the unknown world, yet in the span of a few terrible hours at Tutuila, they were forced to acknowledge their own profound, fatal limitations. The silence that followed their departure from the cove was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, expectant quiet that follows an irreversible fracture in the human experience. The tragedy at Asu stood as a chilling, undeniable refutation of the colonial arrogance that presumed the world was an empty stage waiting to be populated by European narratives of discovery. Instead, it revealed that the Pacific was already deeply populated by cultures with their own ancient, complex, and highly protected boundaries that would not be surrendered or ignored without a horrific, bloody toll. In the decades that followed, the memory of that day in December 1787 began to undergo a slow, deliberate, and deeply ironic transformation in the European consciousness. The event was not remembered primarily as a failure of communication, a collapse of diplomatic foresight, or a tragic misunderstanding born of desperation and cultural ignorance. Rather, it was stripped of its nuanced human reality and crudely refashioned into a convenient, sensationalist cautionary tale, a dark, Gothic warning designed to reinforce the very prejudices that had caused the bloodshed in the first place. Cartographers and imperial administrators, looking back upon the maps of the region, officially renamed the beautiful, serene cove Massacre Bay, a designation that functioned less as a geographical identification and more as a violent, exclusionary signal to future explorers. This naming convention served to effectively brand the entire island of Tutuila, and indeed the broader Samoan archipelago, as a site of inherent, unpredictable danger, a place where the rules of civilized engagement were supposedly suspended by the presence of a population they felt compelled to characterize as dangerously volatile. This historical reductionism was a second, quieter form of violence, one that effectively silenced the indigenous perspective, erasing the historical reality of their defensive response to an unprovoked violation of their sacred resources and substituting it with a narrative of primitive, inexplicable savagery. The irony of this legacy is perhaps the most stinging component of the entire tragedy. The French expedition, which had genuinely sought to represent the pinnacle of enlightened, objective, and peaceful exploration, ultimately left behind a reputation that helped solidify the very barriers they had supposedly hoped to dismantle. By framing the encounter through the lens of their own trauma and loss, they effectively obscured the reality that they were, in fact, the architects of the calamity. The warning against Massacre Bay became an essential, unwritten rule of Pacific maritime culture, a cautionary myth that served to justify the more aggressive, militaristic, and exploitative colonial strategies that would arrive in the wake of the 18th century explorers. The blood spilled on the coral sand was not allowed to serve as a genuine lesson in humility or cultural empathy. Instead, it was weaponized to characterize the indigenous inhabitants as hostile and untrustworthy, providing the necessary moral, strategic, and political pretext for later imperial interventions that would systematically erode the very sovereignty the Samoan people had so fiercely and rightfully defended at Asu. Yet, despite the systematic, centuries-long effort to obscure the truth behind the convenient veneer of the savage massacre narrative, the physical memory of the event persisted, anchored to the landscape of Tutuila in a way that defied the colonial rewriting of history. Deep within the lush, overgrown, and secluded interior of the valley, the physical reality of the tragedy remained, a stubborn, unyielding witness that refused to be silenced by maps or imperial decrees. The French, in a somber, retrospective attempt to reconcile with the memory of their fallen, eventually returned to the site to erect a physical monument, a solid, solemn stone cross that serves as a permanent, anchor-like presence in the landscape. This monument, while ostensibly intended as a respectful memorial for the lost, stands today as a profoundly ambiguous, multifaceted artifact of the encounter. It is a symbol of the immense, lingering grief of the families left behind in France, a monument to the scientific and navigational ambitions that drove the expedition into the heart of the Pacific, and simultaneously an enduring, material acknowledgement of the catastrophic, violent failure of that ambition. The cross, weathered by decades of tropical storms and swallowed by the relentless, encroaching growth of the surrounding rainforest, is now a part of the island's environment, a silent observer of the passage of time. It is a testament to the fact that, regardless of the narrative frameworks imposed upon it, the violence at Asu remains an indelible, inseparable component of the shared history of Samoa and the French nation. To contemplate the legacy of Asu today is to engage in a necessary, deeply uncomfortable act of historical reflection, an acknowledgement that the trauma of the encounter was never truly resolved or healed, but merely buried beneath layers of subsequent events. For the contemporary observer, the story of the massacre serves as a vital, sobering reminder of the ethical, intellectual, and human imperatives that must govern any genuine, respectful engagement between disparate cultures. It highlights the profound, dangerous consequences of operating from a position of unchecked, unexamined, and highly arrogant certainty, of believing that one's own scientific, political, or cultural perspective is the singular, universal standard by which all other human experiences must be measured. The tragedy at Asu was not the result of a singular, inexplicable act of evil, but rather the cumulative, devastating product of a fundamental failure of the human capacity for empathy. It was a failure that occurred at the level of the individual, the mission, and the imperial project itself. A failure that cost 61 men their peace of mind, their safety, and for 12 of them, their very lives. As we look toward the future, the lessons of this tragic episode must continue to inform the way we navigate the increasingly interconnected, complex, and global landscape of the 21st century. The ghosts of aces serve as an eternal, silent chorus, reminding us that every time we reach out to discover or engage with an unfamiliar world, we carry with us the potential to be as destructive as we are enlightened. They remind us that the waters we sail and the lands we traverse are never truly empty, never truly waiting to be claimed, and that the history of every place we encounter is already written in the language of those who have sustained it, protected it, and called it home for generations. The legacy of the Asa massacre is not that of a simple, closed chapter in the history of exploration, but an ongoing, living challenge to our collective capacity for humility, for genuine listening, and for a deep, sustained recognition of our shared, fragile, and often profoundly contradictory humanity. In the end, the stone cross in the valley remains, an enduring, silent, and deeply meaningful sentinel that challenges us to look beyond the simplistic, sensationalist narratives of the past and to embrace the full, unflinching reality of our common, blood-stained, and deeply human history. It invites us to remember not just the names carved into its surface, but the profound, resonant, and largely forgotten silence of the people who defended their sacred ground, the silence of the sailors who died for their own hubris, and the silence of the sea itself, which continues to hold the memory of that day, indifferent to our efforts to understand, to judge, or to justify the violence that occurred upon its shores. It is a legacy of unfinished, necessary work, a call to continue the search for truth, for understanding, and for a more profound, genuinely respectful, and mutually recognizing relationship with the world and all those who inhabit it, far beyond the narrow, violent confines of the cove where the world once ended for the men of the astrolabe. The final, enduring resonance of the Asa massacre is found not in the sterile, archival accounts of the French Admiralty, nor in the carefully curated stone monument standing in the humid silence of the valley, but in the collective, evolving memory of the Samoan people and the broader, shifting consciousness of the Pacific world. History is rarely a static record. It is a living, breathing landscape, continuously reshaped by the currents of present-day reflection, justice, and the ongoing, difficult work of post-colonial reconciliation. For generations, the narrative of that December morning was filtered through the biased lenses of European travelogues and colonial records, which prioritized the perspective of the fallen explorers and relegated the indigenous defenders to the status of an antagonistic, monolithic other. Yet, as the 20th and 21st centuries had demanded a more critical, inclusive, and nuanced accounting of the past, the story of Asu has been reclaimed, transformed from a simple tale of maritime tragedy into a profound, multifaceted examination of resistance, cultural integrity, and the enduring resilience of ancestral sovereignty. The descendants of those who stood upon the beach at Asu hold a history that has never been reliant on the written, ink-stained pages of French journals. It is a history passed down through oral tradition, through the connection to the land itself, and through the steadfast preservation of the knowledge that their ancestors acted not out of mindless savagery, but out of a legitimate, unwavering duty to protect their sacred ancestral territory from an uninvited, highly intrusive, and profoundly disrespectful foreign presence. This reclamation of the narrative represents a vital, necessary shift in how we understand the encounter, moving away from the sensationalism of the massacre and toward a grounded, contextualized understanding of a clash between fundamentally different, and at the time, entirely irreconcilable concepts of ownership and human value. The French arrival, characterized by its disregard for local protocol and its aggressive, extraction-focused methodology, serves as a quintessential example of the systemic hubris that characterized the era of European expansion. By analyzing the event through this lens, we can begin to appreciate that the violence which occurred was not an anomaly, but the inevitable, tragic outcome of a worldview that failed to recognize the humanity of those who existed outside its own narrow, imperial boundaries. The Samoan people, by contrast, demonstrated a sophisticated, highly organized, and deeply moral commitment to the integrity of their domain, a commitment that required immense courage in the face of technologically superior, heavily armed vessels. To ignore this, to label their defense as a mere massacre, is to deny them their historical agency and to perpetuate the very colonial logic that fueled the initial conflict. Consequently, the memory of Asu today is an act of historical justice, a process of stripping away the layers of European-centric interpretation to reveal the underlying truth of a society that fought for its survival against an existential threat. Furthermore, the massacre at Asu forces us to confront the limitations of our own modern historical empathy. It is easy to look back across the centuries and pass judgment on the actions of individuals long dead, to condemn the violence or to mourn the loss of life, but it is far more challenging to truly inhabit the space between these two cultures. To do so requires a willingness to acknowledge that the civilized explorers were capable of devastating ignorance and brutality, and that the primitive inhabitants were capable of high levels of strategic planning, communal discipline, and moral reasoning. The true trial of Asu is not the one we imagine occurred on the deck of the Bussole, but the one we conduct within ourselves as we engage with the story. It challenges us to interrogate our own biases, our own comfortable assumptions about progress, and our own tendency to simplify complex historical events into digestible narratives of heroes and villains. The massacre refuses to be simplified. It remains a raw, discordant, and persistently unsettling point in time that demands we sit with the discomfort of its ambiguity, accepting that there can be no easy resolution to the pain and the loss that occurred on that beach. The ongoing significance of the monument, the stone cross that has become so deeply embedded in the island's geography, speaks to the strange, complex ways in which history persists. It is no longer just a monument to the French, nor is it a symbol of indigenous defeat. It has become a neutral, silent witness to the intersection of two trajectories that were forever altered by their meeting. It reminds us that places themselves hold memory, that the sands of Asu Bay, now largely quiet and untouched by the grand, tragic drama of that morning, still bear the unspoken weight of the past. For the people of Samoa, the site is part of a landscape that is deeply meaningful and thoroughly documented through their own connection to it. For the French, it remains a site of pilgrimage and national reflection, a place where the hubris and the suffering of their ancestors are rendered in stone. This duality is not a contradiction but a reflection of the reality of shared history, where the memories of the colonizer and the colonized, the invader and the defender, are inextricably entwined. As we look toward the horizon, the story of Asu serves as a bridge, albeit a fragile and often painful one, between our present and the complexities of the past. It serves as a reminder that the world is, and has always been, a place of immense, overlapping, and deeply significant narratives, many of which have been lost, silenced, or distorted by the passage of time. The duty of the modern historian, the storyteller, and indeed the citizen of the world, is to engage with these narratives with humility, with care, and with an unwavering commitment to the truth, however difficult or uncomfortable that truth may be. We must learn to read the silence of the sea, the stillness of the valley, and the endurance of the monument, hearing in them not just the echoes of the dead, but the call to build a future grounded in a more profound, genuinely respectful, and mutually recognizing global community. The massacre at Asu was a moment of profound darkness, a collapse into violence that destroyed lives and legacies on both sides of the coral reef. Yet, in our act of remembering, not just as a record of conflict, but as a site of reflection, we have the potential to turn that darkness toward a glimmer of understanding. The final accounting of the Asu event must therefore be one of humility. It must be a recognition that our understanding is always incomplete, that the past is always subject to the perspectives we bring to it, and that the ultimate lesson of the tragedy is the imperative to treat the other with the recognition and dignity that we ourselves desire. The story of Captain de Langley and his ill-fated crew, of the Matai and their warriors, of the mission that sought to chart the world but instead lost its way in the surf. This is a story that belongs not to the history of one nation, but to the history of our shared human experience. It is a story that requires us to be better, to reach higher, and to understand that the true discovery is not the charting of new lands, but the discovery of our own capacities for prejudice, for courage, and for the deeply transformative power of empathy. As the currents of the Pacific continue to wash over the sands of Asu, and as the seasons continue to cycle through the lush valley of Tutuila, the memory of that day remains, not as a finished history, but as an ongoing conversation, a quiet, resonant challenge to all who hear its tale. It is a call to recognize the sanctity of the ground we walk upon, the deep complexity of the people we encounter, and the heavy, sacred responsibility we carry as the inheritors of a history written in both the light of enlightenment and the darkness of our own profound, recurring failures. May we continue to carry this burden with the awareness that in the silence between the waves, the past is always present, watching, waiting, and reminding us of the high cost of forgetting and the eternal, urgent value of remembering with truth and with grace. The journey of the astrolabe and the bussole was intended to end in glory and national acclaim, yet its final destination, reached through the path of tragedy, became the catalyst for a much deeper, more difficult, and perhaps more significant journey. The journey toward a world that recognizes, honors, and protects the dignity of all its people, regardless of the boundaries they cross or the shadows they cast upon the sand. This is the true and final legacy of Asu Bay, a legacy that continues to unfold, unfolding like the rising tide that once claimed the boats and the lives of those caught in the storm of their own making, a tide that now carries the hope of a more understanding and more just human future. The narrative of the Asu tragedy does not find its ultimate conclusion in the dry, chronological records of 18th-century maritime history, nor does it dissolve into the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the Pacific tide that continues to reclaim the sands of Tutuila every passing day. Instead, its final, enduring resonance is located in the profound, existential transformation of what it means to witness and to remember a historical event of such catastrophic, irreconcilable depth. When we reflect upon the legacy of the massacre, we are essentially grappling with the monumental, ongoing project of reconciling the fractured, often bloody history of the Pacific with our modern, increasingly globalized, and hopefully more empathetic understanding of human interaction. The massacre, having long been categorized as a mere, dark footnote in the expansive story of French naval ambition, now stands as a primary, foundational text in the critical examination of our shared, often violent past. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of the tragedy, beyond the immediate, visceral details of the violence, and to interrogate the very systems of thought and belief that allowed such a calamity to occur in the first place. We are forced to consider the extent to which our current perceptions of the past are still deeply, perhaps inextricably, shaped by the colonial structures that first sought to define, classify, and eventually dominate the people and the territories they encountered. To truly honor the complexity of the Asu experience, one must be willing to abandon the comfort of monolithic, one-sided narratives that prioritize the suffering of one group while marginalizing the agency of the other. The true, final accounting of the massacre requires a radical act of historical imagination, a persistent effort to hear the silenced voices of the Samoan ancestors who defended their sacred ground with the same fervor, duty, and commitment to collective survival that the French sailors felt for their own mission and their own king. When we manage to weave these disparate, often contradictory perspectives together, we begin to perceive a history that is not a linear, progressive march toward enlightenment, but a layered, tumultuous, and profoundly human struggle toward recognition and mutual respect. This historical process is, in its own way, a form of restitution, a way of returning to the scene of the trauma and refusing to allow the violence to be the final word. It is a commitment to the idea that our shared history is not something that is settled and finalized in the dusty archives of the past, but something that is continually, urgently, and purposefully renegotiated in the present. The presence of the stone cross in the valley, a silent, weathered sentinel in the vibrant, reclaiming rainforest, serves as a powerful, material bridge between these distant worlds. It is an artifact that demands we confront our own modern positionality. We are the inheritors of both the ambition that led the French into the bay and the consequences that were endured by the people who stood upon the shore. We cannot distance ourselves from this history by framing it as a distant, exotic, or primitive event that occurred in a vacuum, entirely separate from the world we inhabit today. The arrogance, the desperation, the cultural myopia, and the fatal collision of interests that manifested at Asu are not relics of a vanished past. They are persistent, recurring, and deeply dangerous patterns of human behavior that continue to shape our interactions, our conflicts, and our efforts to build sustainable, peaceful futures. The cross stands as a permanent, immovable challenge to the ease with which we might forget the lessons of history, a constant, physical reminder that the price of such failures is always measured in human lives, in shattered dreams, and in the permanent, irreversible alteration of the world. As the narrative of Asu Bay continues to be told, refined, and understood, it must be approached with the grace and the humility that the original explorers so conspicuously lacked. This is not to say that we should shy away from the harsh, unflinching realities of the violence or the profound, tragic loss of life that occurred. Rather, it is to suggest that our retelling must be imbued with a commitment to justice, a refusal to shy away from the difficult questions of culpability, and a deep, sustained recognition of the common humanity that binds the fallen, the survivors, the defenders, and the descendants together. We must see the event not as a closed, completed story, but as a living, urgent invitation to build a world where the destructive, blind, and imperialistic impulses of the past are systematically replaced by a sincere, transformative commitment to the dignity and the sovereign integrity of all people. This is the only path forward that acknowledges the true scale and the ultimate significance of what happened in the surf at Tutuila. It is a path that honors the silence of the valley by filling it with the resonant, truthful, and restorative echoes of genuine human connection. The final, lingering perspective on the Asa massacre is one that finds hope not in the erasure of the tragedy, but in our shared capacity to transform it into a source of wisdom. The waters of the cove, which once swirled with the chaotic, violent energy of a dying expedition, are today a place of serene, natural beauty, a space that seems to exist outside the frantic, destructive pace of the human world. This natural endurance is perhaps the most profound lesson of all. The land, the sea, and the forest possess a capacity for healing that far outlasts our temporary, often misguided efforts to dominate, claim, or understand them. By aligning our historical perspective with this long, enduring rhythm, we find a sense of proportion that allows us to view our own history with all its deep, painful fissures, from a perspective of stability and enduring truth. We are reminded that we are merely transient observers of a vast, complex, and ancient world, and that our efforts to record, to justify, or to memorialize our history must always be tempered by the awareness that we are ultimately a part of the nature we seek to describe. In concluding this exploration of the massacre, we are left with the undeniable, haunting presence of the past, a presence that does not demand we look back with despair or resignation, but rather that we move forward with a deepened, refined, and more compassionate understanding of the high cost of ignorance. The men of the Astrolabe and the Bustle, in their ultimate, tragic failure, have left us a final, unintended gift, a template for recognizing our own potential for catastrophe, and a guide for how we might avoid such a future. Their story is a beacon, flickering, fading, yet persistent, casting its light into the dark, hidden corners of our own, modern consciousness. It encourages us to look at one another not as competitors in a zero-sum game of dominance and resource extraction, but as partners in a fragile, infinitely precious, and genuinely shared existence. The tragedy at Asa Bay, in its final, most profound iteration, becomes a catalyst for the very thing the expedition itself failed to achieve, the genuine, transformative, and deeply human discovery of one another, across the vast, deep, and sometimes dangerous waters that divide us toward a shared, more enlightened, and more just future. Thus, the legacy of Asu is not one of finality, but of eternal, urgent beginning. It is a story that refuses to die, a memory that demands to be acknowledged, and a history that calls us to account for the way we treat the world and the people who inhabit it. As the sun sets over the quiet, emerald slopes of Tutuila and the moon casts its long, silver light across the dark, undulating surface of the bay, the spirits of the past remain in the whisper of the wind, the rustle of the leaves, and the relentless, rhythmic motion of the ocean. They are not ghosts to be feared, but witnesses to be honored, guides to be listened to, and mentors who teach us that the most important, meaningful, and enduring legacy we can leave is not the maps we draw or the borders we impose, but the depth of our understanding, the breadth of our compassion, and the sincerity of our commitment to the sacred, undeniable value of the common, shared, and precious life we all lead. The voyage continues, the stories evolve, and the truth, in its slow, patient, and uncompromising way, continues to emerge, reminding us that though the world is vast and the history is deep, we are all ultimately sailing upon the same ocean, driven by the same hunger for meaning and destined to find our way, together, toward a dawn that is guided not by the cold, distant light of hubris, but by the warm, steady, and life-affirming light of a genuine, informed, and deeply rooted human love. This is the truth of Asu, a truth that endures as long as there are those willing to listen, to learn, and to live with the grace of a history fully, truthfully, and compassionately acknowledged. The story of Asu, now fully chronicled and reflected upon, transcends the boundaries of a simple historical narrative. It stands as a permanent, immovable landmark in the collective conscience of those who seek to understand the delicate, often treacherous intersection of discovery and destruction. If we were to attempt to distill the essence of this entire, agonizingly complex experience into a singular, profound realization, it would be the recognition of the sheer, terrifying fragility of the human endeavor when it is divorced from the stabilizing, guiding principles of humility and genuine cultural respect. The men of the French expedition were, in their own minds, the vanguard of a superior, enlightened civilization, carrying with them the tools, the knowledge, and the scientific mission to catalog the unknown corners of the globe. Yet, as the bloody, chaotic events of that December morning so clearly demonstrated, this self-perception of superiority was precisely the catalyst for their unraveling. It created a psychological and intellectual blind spot so profound that they could not, or would not, see the humanity, the sovereignty, or the spiritual complexity of the people whose land they had effectively invaded. This blindness was not an accident. It was an inherent, systemic feature of the imperial mindset that governed the entire age of exploration, a mindset that fundamentally predicated the right to discover upon the erasure of the reality of those already present. When we consider the ultimate resolution of the Asu event, or rather, the lack thereof, we are confronted with the reality that history does not often provide us with the cathartic, moralizing endings we desire. The massacre was not resolved by justice, nor was it rectified by an apology or a grand act of reconciliation. It simply passed into the ledger of the past, becoming a fixed, unchangeable component of the world's fabric. This absence of a neat, satisfying resolution is perhaps the most important lesson the event has to offer us. It teaches us that our actions, especially those born of ignorance, desperation, or hubris, carry consequences that extend far beyond our immediate reach, rippling forward through time and creating permanent, often painful legacies that subsequent generations are then tasked with carrying. The French sailors and the Samoan warriors who perished in the bay are long gone, their stories settled into the earth and the sea, but the profound, resonant significance of their final, fatal encounter remains with us, an active, demanding presence that forces us to reconcile with the darker, less palatable aspects of our common, shared history. Furthermore, we must recognize that the responsibility for engaging with this legacy does not lie solely with the descendants of the French or the Samoan people, but is a shared, global responsibility for all who take an interest in the history of human interaction. The narrative of Asu is not a closed, provincial story about an isolated island in the South Pacific. It is a profound, universal fable about the dangers of unchecked power, the limitations of technological superiority, and the eternal, urgent necessity of recognizing the humanity of the other. In an age where global connectivity, information exchange, and technological capability have reached heights far beyond the wildest dreams of the 18th century explorers, the fundamental, moral challenge of Asu remains unchanged. We are still navigating the same complex and potentially dangerous waters of cultural encounter, and we are still prone to the same devastating failures of empathy and understanding that claimed the lives of those involved in the Tutuila massacre. The only difference is that our mistakes now possess the potential for even greater, more systemic, and more irreparable harm. The persistence of the memory of Asu is, therefore, a safeguard, a warning bell that continues to ring across the centuries. It calls us to be perpetually vigilant against the reemergence of that specific, toxic combination of arrogance and ignorance that blinded the French to the reality of the Samoan people. It reminds us that every time we project our own, limited cultural frameworks onto a world that is inherently diverse, complex, and filled with its own, equally valid systems of meaning, we run the risk of causing damage that can never truly be repaired. The stone cross in the valley serves as a physical, anchored anchor point for this vigilance, a silent witness that prevents the tragedy from being conveniently forgotten or sanitized. It invites us to pause, to look, and to listen, to recognize the reality of the past not as a series of abstract, historical events, but as a visceral, living truth that continues to inform our present and our potential for future harm or, alternatively, for true, restorative understanding. As we bring this exploration of Asu to its final reflection, we find that the most significant, transformative outcome of the massacre is the potential for growth and change it presents to those willing to engage with it. The tragedy, while irredeemably horrific, has become a source of profound, collective insight. It has forced us to confront the reality that there is no singular, objective truth to the history of exploration, but rather a constellation of perspectives, experiences, and cultural realities that must all be given the weight they are due. It has compelled us to recognize that the pursuit of knowledge, whether it be scientific, historical, or cultural, must always be secondary to the preservation of human dignity and the maintenance of a fundamental, empathetic connection between all people. By embracing this perspective, we honor the lives that were lost on both sides of the reef, not by enshrining their conflict, but by allowing their collective tragedy to serve as a beacon for a different, better, and more deeply grounded future. The journey that began with the grand, imperial ambition of King Louis XVI and the disciplined, rational intent of Comte de la Pérouse, and that took a sudden, violent detour into the heart of a savage, uncomprehended, and deeply tragic encounter, has finally arrived at a place of deeper, clearer, and more compassionate understanding. We have navigated the treacherous currents of the past, looked unflinchingly into the abyss of the massacre, and in doing so, we have discovered that the truth is a far more robust, complex, and ultimately, a far more healing force than the simple, comforting myths we use to protect ourselves from the reality of our own history. We are left, finally, with a profound sense of gratitude for the persistence of the memory of Asu, and with a renewed, steadfast commitment to the work of understanding, not just the history of the world, but the history of the humanity that we all share. The memory of the event remains a vital, pulsing thread in the tapestry of our collective existence, a thread that refuses to be cut or hidden. It reminds us that we are all, in our own, often fumbling and imperfect ways, attempting to navigate the same vast and frequently turbulent ocean of human experience. We are all prone to error, all capable of profound, destructive miscalculations, and all equally in need of the patience, the humility, and the genuine, deep-seated compassion that is required to truly understand one another. The tragedy at Asu Bay is a testament to the fact that when we fail to find these qualities, the cost is far greater than we can ever truly calculate. Yet, in our act of remembering, we find the potential for a small, but essential, measure of redemption, a way of ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not merely repeated, but transformed into the wisdom that will carry us, together, toward a future that is defined not by the violence of the surf, but by the calm, steady, and shared light of a humanity that has finally, truly learned to see itself in the face of the other. The history of ASU is not a burden to be discarded, but a vital, foundational, and truly precious inheritance, a reminder of who we were, a reflection of who we are, and most importantly, a challenge to become who we must, for the sake of our common future, aspire to be. As the waves continue to break on the distant shore of Tutuila, and as the memory of that day continues to stir in the hearts of those who carry its truth, we are left with the final, enduring realization that the story of humanity is one that is always being written, and that it is up to us, in our own time and in our own unique ways, to ensure that it is a story of reconciliation, of truth, and of a deep, abiding, and truly universal love. The finality of the ASU narrative does not rest in the cold ledger of historical record, but in the enduring, quiet wisdom of those who continue to live with the memory of that day, a memory that has transitioned from a wound into a scar, and ultimately, into a part of the cultural DNA of both the Samoan people and the historical consciousness of the French nation. To stand upon that shoreline today, where the air is thick with the scent of sea salt and the damp, earthy fragrance of the surrounding jungle, is to be acutely aware of the ghosts that still inhabit the space between the waves and the trees. It is a place where the grand, unfulfilled ambitions of an Enlightenment-era expedition met the absolute, unyielding reality of an indigenous world, and in that collision, something fundamentally changed in the way we perceive the act of exploration itself. We are left with a profound, inescapable understanding that discovery is never a neutral, value-free action. It is an intrusion, a shift, and a permanent alteration of the landscape and the cultures that have called that landscape home for time immemorial. The story of ASU serves as the ultimate, definitive lesson for every traveler, scientist, and sovereign power that seeks to engage with the unknown, that before one can ever hope to map a territory, one must first be willing to map the depths of one's own biases, fears, and assumptions about the nature of the human experience. As we conclude this long, arduous, and deeply reflective journey through the history of the Asa massacre, we must recognize that the most significant discovery made during this process is not a geographical or navigational one, but an internal, psychological one. We have discovered the profound and often painful capacity of the human heart to hold both the capacity for immense, systemic destruction and the potential for a similarly profound, restorative grace. The French expedition, in its desperate, scurvy-stricken haste, failed to recognize the humanity of the Samoans, and the Samoan warriors, in their defensive, martial fury, were unable to see the individual suffering of the men they were forced to engage. This failure of recognition, this blinding, reflexive reliance on the labels of stranger, invader, or enemy, is the true, historical failure that occurred in the Bay. It is a failure that remains a constant, looming threat in our own, modern world, where the same reductive impulses toward polarization and dehumanization continue to thrive, often dressed in the new, technological language of our own age. The story of ASU, therefore, acts as a mirror, a clear, reflective surface that shows us not just the shadows of the past, but the recurring, contemporary patterns of our own, imperfect humanity. The enduring resonance of the ASU event also speaks to the profound spiritual necessity of commemoration, the act of looking back and acknowledging the reality of what was done, not to seek vengeance, but to ensure that the truth is allowed to breathe and to speak. For too long, the silence surrounding the massacre was a silence born of shame and the desire to forget, a silence that allowed the tragedy to fester and grow in the dark, unexamined corners of history. By breaking that silence, by bringing the reality of the violence, the misunderstanding, and the loss into the light, we participate in a restorative process that is essential for any healthy, functioning society. We honor the dead, not by enshrining their conflict as a justification for further harm, but by learning from their tragedy and by transforming that learning into an active, living commitment to a different, more humane way of being in the world. This is the only way to genuinely honor the lives of the French sailors who perished in the surf and the lives of the Samoan defenders who were cut down by the muskets of a retreating force. It is by ensuring that their collective, shared history becomes the foundation for a future where such a tragedy is not just avoided, but is viewed as a fundamental violation of the very values we claim to hold dear. As we look out over the Pacific, toward the horizon that the Boussole and the Astrolabe once scanned with such desperate, world-spanning ambition, we are reminded of the inherent, breathtaking scale of the world and the immense, often overwhelming responsibility that comes with being a part of it. We are not the masters of this world, nor are we its rightful, unencumbered owners. We are, at best, its stewards, its observers, and its humble, fleeting participants. The history of Asu teaches us the value of being still, of being patient, and of recognizing that the most profound insights are often found not in the bold, triumphant declarations of conquerors and explorers, but in the quiet, patient listening to the stories of those who have been marginalized, erased, or forgotten. It is a call to be more conscious of our presence, more aware of our impact, and more dedicated to the principle that the pursuit of knowledge must always be accompanied by a profound, uncompromising respect for the dignity and the autonomy of all human beings. This, finally, is the true, lasting meaning of Asu. It is an invitation to inhabit our world with more care, with more understanding, and with a deeper, more intentional sense of our shared, common destiny. The memory of the event will persist as long as there are those who remember the name, those who understand the history, and those who continue to seek the truth amidst the noise of the contemporary world. It will persist in the quiet, rhythmic motion of the ocean, in the resilient growth of the forest, and in the hearts of those who have taken the time to listen to the echoes of that long-ago December morning. And in that persistence, there is a quiet, steady, and truly powerful hope, a hope that we are slowly, painfully, and yet surely learning to become a more compassionate, a more informed, and a more truly human community. We are the survivors of the long, dark history of such encounters, and we are the builders of the new, more inclusive, and more respectful future that those encounters demand of us. Let the story of Asu be the ground upon which we build this future, a ground that is hardened by the reality of the past but made fertile by the promise of our own, developing empathy and our own, growing and truly global, human wisdom. The voyage may have ended in tragedy, but the journey of understanding that it ignited continues, a journey that invites each of us to take our place on the deck, to look out toward the vast, uncharted horizon of the human experience, and to steer our course, always and forever, toward the light of truth and the sustaining warmth of a genuine, shared, and deeply enduring human connection. In the end, we find that the most significant and truly lasting legacy of the massacre is the realization that we are all, in our own, fragile, and often contradictory ways, part of the same, unfolding, and eternal story. The men of the French expedition and the people of Tutuila were caught in the tides of a history much larger and more complex than they could ever have understood at the time. Today, with the benefit of hindsight and the clarity of a more inclusive, globally aware perspective, we have the immense and deeply humbling opportunity to weave these disparate threads into a single, comprehensive narrative, a narrative that does not shy away from the tragedy, but instead uses it to illuminate the path toward a more humane, compassionate, and truly enlightened existence. We are the architects of this narrative, and it is our responsibility to ensure that it reflects the highest, most inclusive, and most truly human values we possess. As the sun rises over the distant volcanic peaks of Samoa, illuminating the vibrant, emerald landscape with the promise of a new day, let us commit ourselves to the work of understanding. Let us vow to carry the memory of Asu with the gravity and the respect it deserves, and let us sail toward the future with the unwavering conviction that our history is not our destiny, but the very foundation upon which we can, if we only try, create a world that is defined by the profound, transformative, and truly universal power of our shared humanity, fully, finally, and forever recognized and honored. This is the truth of the Bay, a truth that endures as long as there are those willing to listen, to learn, and to live with the grace of a history fully, truthfully, and compassionately acknowledged. The final word, if there is to be one, belongs to the sea, which continues its eternal, rhythmic motion, washing over the sand, the stone, and the memory, an indifferent, powerful, and truly ancient presence that reminds us that we are only ever here for a short time, and that the only thing that truly matters is the love, the understanding, and the profound, abiding respect we show for one another while we remain. This is the ultimate, final, and truly significant conclusion to the story of Asu Bay. The conclusion of the Asu narrative, when viewed through the long, telescopic lens of history, reveals itself as a profound meditation on the nature of human memory and the ethical obligations we owe to the past. It is an acknowledgement that the events of that fateful December morning in 1787 were not merely a casualty of colonial expansion, but a foundational rupture in the relationship between the European Enlightenment and the indigenous world of the Pacific. To write the final chapter of this account is to move beyond the mere reporting of facts or the lamentation of losses, and to enter a space of active, purposeful reflection, a space where we recognize that the massacre was an event that effectively closed one door on the human experience while simultaneously kicking open another, much more difficult and much more necessary door of global reckoning. The legacy of the massacre, therefore, is not found in the resolution of the conflict itself, for that conflict continues in the ongoing, quiet, and persistent struggles of indigenous peoples for self-determination, for cultural recognition, and for the sovereign integrity of their ancestral lands. It is found, instead, in the enduring, stubborn fact of our shared, interdependent future, and in the recognition that the progress of one group cannot be built upon the erasure or the exploitation of another. If we are to truly learn from the wreckage at Asu, we must adopt a radical, uncompromising stance toward the way we document, interpret, and teach history. We must move away from the heroic, triumphalist narratives of discovery that have dominated the annals of Western historiography for centuries and embrace a more polyphonic, multifaceted approach, one that gives equal weight to the perspectives of the people on the shore as it does to the people on the decks of the ships. This is not an act of historical revisionism, but an act of historical correction, a necessary, overdue alignment of the record with the fullness of the human truth. It is about recognizing that the discovery of the Navigator Islands by the French was, for the Samoan people, a catastrophic, uninvited intervention, and that the massacre they were accused of perpetrating was, in their own, deeply held and culturally coherent narrative, a defensive act of sovereign protection. By elevating these indigenous perspectives, we do not diminish the tragedy of the French loss, but we provide it with the context it desperately lacks, the context of a collision between a world that viewed itself as the apex of human achievement and a world that possessed its own, equally profound and perfectly self-sufficient sense of order, morality, and belonging. This shift in perspective is, in many ways, the most difficult and the most essential labor of the contemporary historian and the contemporary citizen. It requires a shedding of the comfortable, self-reinforcing myths that have long served as the bedrock of our understanding of the world. It requires the courage to sit with the discomfort of realizing that our ancestors, in their reach for greatness, were capable of profound, systemic failures of heart and mind. And it requires the capacity to believe that we, in our own time, can do better, that we can engage with the world with a sense of wonder and humility that is not predatory, and with a respect for difference that is not rooted in a hierarchy of technological or cultural status. The story of Asu is the ultimate litmus test for this modern commitment. If we can look at the broken, bloody sands of that bay and feel not just the horror of the violence, but the necessity of understanding the human struggle behind it, then we have begun the work of truly and finally closing the account on the colonial era. The quiet, enduring presence of the stone cross in the valley, long since reclaimed by the encroaching, relentless green of the rainforest, stands as a testament to the fact that we are all, ultimately, subject to the same, overwhelming, and indifferent processes of nature and time. The grand, imperial, and nationalistic aspirations that fueled the voyage of La Perouse and de Langley have been reduced, in the grand sweep of history, to a single, small memorial, a point of reflection that is as much about the failure of the endeavor as it is about the sacrifice of those who participated in it. This perspective of scale, offered by the passage of centuries, is perhaps the most humbling lesson we can draw from the tragedy. It reminds us that our projects, our monuments, and our stories are all temporary, fleeting efforts to make sense of a world that is far larger, far older, and far more complex than any of us can ever truly comprehend. The tragedy at Asu reminds us that the only thing that remains after the ships have sailed and the shouting has faded is the quality of our actions and the depth of the compassion we held for one another while we were here. As we bring this multi-part narrative to a close, we must remember that the story does not end with the final words on this page. It lives on in the ongoing, vibrant, and multifaceted culture of Samoa. It lives on in the archival efforts of those who continue to seek the truth in the documents of the past, and it lives on in the hearts of every individual who finds in the story of the massacre a reason to reach out across the boundaries of culture, geography, and belief to find a genuine, authentic human connection. The massacre at Asa Bay is a wound that has served as a portal through which we have gained access to a more profound, more painful, and ultimately a more honest understanding of what it means to be human in a world that is both desperately in need of and profoundly capable of the transformative power of grace. We owe it to the fallen, we owe it to the defenders, and we owe it to ourselves to carry this lesson forward with a renewed, steadfast, and deeply held commitment to a future where such tragedies are not just avoided, but are viewed as fundamentally antithetical to the very essence of who we, as a collective, human family, seek to become. The sea, which once surged with the blood of the two disparate worlds, continues to wash the shore of Tutuila in a rhythmic, eternal, and cleansing motion. It does not judge the past, nor does it wait for our approval to continue its cycle. It simply is. It serves as a constant, rhythmic, and truly powerful reminder that there is a reality far larger than the history we write or the monuments we build, a reality that is defined by the vast, deep, and truly universal currents of life, of struggle, and of the enduring, quiet hope for a better way to live. The story of Asu, as it has been explored here, is our small, humble contribution to that ongoing, vital, and truly human work. It is an effort to acknowledge the past, to learn from its darkness, and to turn our eyes toward the light of a future that is defined by the depth of our understanding, the breadth of our compassion, and the sincerity of our belief in the fundamental, undeniable value of our shared, common, and precious humanity. The voyage continues, the truth remains, and the work, as always, is just beginning. Let us walk toward that future with the wisdom gained from the past, with the empathy required for the present, and with the unshakable, deeply rooted, and truly human hope that we can, at long last, find our way toward a lasting and a truly profound, universal peace. This is the truth of the Bay, a truth that endures as long as there are those willing to listen, to learn, and to live with the grace of a history fully, truthfully, and compassionately acknowledged, and it is in this acknowledgement that we finally and fully find our way home.